All right. Ready to geek out on some economics?
Always game for a deep dive. Let's do it.
Today, it's all about supply and demand. And I know what you're thinking sounds a little dry, right? But trust me, this stuff is the invisible hand behind, well, pretty much everything.
It's way more exciting than those dusty textbooks make it seem. We're talking about the forces that determine how much things cost, why some things seem to defy logic. Like, have you ever wondered how those designer handbags get away with costing more than a month's rent?
Okay, yeah, that's always baffled me.
Supply and demand, my friend. It explains a lot.
Well, color me intrigued. We're using a great piece from Investopedia as our guide today. You can find the link in the show notes, and they really break it down in a way that makes sense.
They do a good job.
So let's start with the basics. Just in case anyone's new to this whole economics game, we've got supply, how much of something is out there in the world, and we've got a demand, how badly people want it. Pretty straightforward, right?
Seems simple enough on the surface, right?
Yeah.
But it's like an intricate dance.
How so?
Well, think about it. The availability of something and how much people want it are constantly in flux. They're directly impacted by all these external factors, sometimes in totally unpredictable ways. It's not a static thing. It's dynamic.
Oh, right. Like with gas prices during the pandemic, our article touched on that. Suddenly everyone's stuck at home, nobody's driving.
And bam, demand for gas goes through the floor. Remember what happened?
Prices tanked. And it wasn't just prices at the pump, I'm guessing.
Not even close. Oil producers had to make some tough decisions fast. They were staring down the barrel of way more supply than demand, so they cut production. Big time.
It really throws a wrench into that whole supply always meets demand idea, doesn't it?
It shows you how reactive this dance really is. But it's not just about external factors like pandemics. It's also about how people behave, how they respond to price changes. And that's where it gets really interesting. We're talking about price elasticity.
Okay, I'm already lost. Price elasticity sounds a little intimidating.
It's simpler than it sounds, I promise.
Yeah.
It just means how much a change in price actually makes people change their minds about buying something.
So, like, if the price of something goes up, do people still buy it?
Exactly. Some things, no matter how expensive they get, people still need them. Think about something like, I don't know, water. Even if the price of water doubled tomorrow.
You'd still have to buy it.
Exactly. You might cut back on other things, but you can't just stop drinking water, you get me. That's what we call inelastic demand. Essential goods, things people rely on, they tend to be less sensitive to price swings, at least within reason.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm guessing it's a different story for those luxury items we were talking about earlier.
Now you're getting it.
So give me an example. Let's say the price of that luxury sports car you've always dreamed of suddenly doubled overnight.
Ouch. Yeah, that'd be a tough pill to swallow. Suddenly that dream car doesn't seem quite as appealing, right?
Definitely puts a damper on things.
And that's elastic demand in action. Those non-essential things, the things we can more easily live without, they're much more sensitive to those price changes.
So it's all about how essential something is, right? How much wiggle room people have in their budgets. But this makes me think about those luxury items that seem to break all the rules. You know, those designer handbags that cost more than a month's rent. How do they get away with that?
Ah, you've stumbled upon Veblen goods. They seem to defy the laws of economics, but there's a psychological aspect at play.
I always wondered about that. Is it really just about status?
A lot of it boils down to signaling. The higher the price tag, the more exclusive and desirable it becomes for a certain type of buyer. They're paying for the bragging rights as much as the actual product. Which honestly, it makes you wonder what happens when that desire for exclusivity starts to apply to things money can't buy.
Like what?
Like clean air or access to nature. Think about it.
Whoa, okay. So we're not just talking about the economics of it all, but also the psychology, the values driving those economic decisions. This is getting deep.
That's what we're here for. And this connection between values and economics, well, it becomes even more fascinating when you start thinking about things like automation. But we'll save that juicy tidbit for later.
Okay, you've got me hooked. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's bring it back to the here and now. Our article mentioned that understanding supply and demand isn't just for economists. It's a vital tool for businesses, too.
Absolutely. Every pricing decision a company makes is a gamble on supply and demand.
So they're constantly trying to strike that balance, the price that's attractive to consumers but also profitable for them, right?
Exactly.
It's making me rethink all those times I've been frustrated by a price hike. And we're back. Before the break, we were talking about how businesses are basically walking this tightrope between supply and demand, trying to find that sweet spot for pricing.
It's a global high wire act for sure. Remember that example from the article about gas prices? When crude oil prices went through the roof back in 2022, every oil-producing nation was basically in a race to, well,
To cash in. I mean, higher prices mean more profit, right?
exactly, supply and demand, baby. But, and this is a big but, ramping up oil production. Not exactly as simple as it sounds.
Oh, I can imagine. It's not like you can just flip a switch and boom, more oil.
Not even close. It takes time. It takes massive investment. Plus, you've got all these logistical hurdles. It's a whole thing. So even though demand for oil was sky high, supply couldn't magically keep up overnight.
And of course, we all saw the results of that at the gas pump.
Painful, wasn't it?
Tell me about it. But it's kind of wild when you think about it. Something that feels so local, like how much I'm paying to fill up my tank, is actually part of this much bigger global system.
It's a chain reaction. And that ripple effect, it's not just limited to gas or oil, it's everywhere. Think about something like, I don't know, computer chips. They're in practically everything these days.
Oh, right. Didn't we see massive supply chain issues with those during the pandemic?
Huge. Suddenly there's a shortage of new cars because they can't get the chips they need. Demand stays high, maybe even goes up, because people are hesitant to buy used cars at those inflated prices. It throws the whole system out of whack.
It's like this intricate dance, but someone tripped and took everyone down with them.
A very expensive dance at that. And that's why understanding these forces is so crucial. It's not just businesses trying to make a profit. It's also about policymakers trying to, not crash the entire economy.
Okay, yeah, that's a slightly higher stakes game than figuring out how much to charge for a cup of coffee.
For sure. And this is where it gets really complicated because imagine being that policymaker. Where do you even start? Do you try to control prices, influence supply, encourage demand? What's the play?
Sounds like a recipe for sleepless nights.
You got that right. It's like a giant game of economic Jenga. Every decision has consequences, some intended, some not, and you're never quite sure which move is going to topple the tower.
Yikes. I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed here.
It's a lot, but it's fascinating stuff. And it makes you think about those larger trends we mentioned earlier, like the whole shift towards sustainable consumption. That has the potential to be a real game changer in how we think about supply and demand.
How so?
Well, as more people prioritize things like ethical sourcing, environmental impact, it could totally reshape what consumers are demanding, even if it means paying a premium.
You mean people might be willing to pay more for something because it's sustainable?
It's already happening. Think about the market for electric cars. They often come with a higher price tag,
Yeah.
but more and more people are deciding that's a trade-off they're willing to make.
Which, of course, then pushes car companies to offer more electric and hybrid options.
Exactly. And suddenly you have this really interesting feedback loop happening. But it's not just about individual products either. It's potentially about rethinking our entire economic system, moving away from that whole take-make-waste model and towards a more circular economy where resources are reused, waste is minimized.
Okay, but what happens when those resources become increasingly scarce? And I'm not just talking about stuff like oil or rare earth minerals. We've been focusing a lot on products, services, things you can buy and sell. But what about clean air, clean water, a healthy planet?
Great point. Those are essential too, and they're becoming increasingly scarce. And that's where things get really, really interesting.
Because suddenly we're not just talking about economic value, but
Yeah.
environmental and social value too.
Exactly. It's a whole new ballgame.
Wow. We started with gas prices, and now we're contemplating the fate of humanity. This is why I love a good deep dive. You never know where it's going to lead.
It's all connected.
And on that cliffhanger, we're going to take a quick break. But don't go anywhere, deep divers, because when we come back, we're stepping into the future of supply and demand. And we're back for the final act of our deep dive into the world of supply and demand.
The grand finale.
We've talked about those core economic principles, how they play out in the real world. But now it's time to get a little sci-fi up in here.
Oh, I like where this is going. Time to break out the crystal ball.
Exactly. What does the future hold for supply and demand? Any predictions? What kind of wild ride are we in for?
If I had a crystal ball that could predict the economic future accurately, well, let's just say I wouldn't be here. I'd be on a beach somewhere.
Fair enough. But we can still make some educated guesses, right? So what's going to shake things up?
Well, one of the biggest game changers on the horizon has got to be automation.
Ah, yes. The robots are coming. But how does that impact supply and demand exactly? Give it to me in plain English.
Okay, so picture this, factories of the future humming along with robots doing practically everything. We're talking 24/7 production, barely any human involvement.
Sounds efficient.
hyper efficient, which could mean lower costs, at least theoretically. Sounds pretty good for the average consumer, right?
Cheaper gadgets. Who doesn't love that? But I feel like there's a but coming.
There's always a but, isn't there?
Yeah.
Here's the thing. If automation leads to mass job displacement,
Oh, right. If people don't have
if
jobs.
they don't have income,
If they don't have income.
they can't buy all those products, even if they're super cheap.
Whoa. So we could end up with an oversupply of stuff and not enough people who can actually afford it.
It's a real possibility. And it highlights how interconnected everything is. Economics, social factors. You can't separate them. It's not enough to just chase efficiency. We also have to consider the impact on people's lives, their livelihoods.
It's like that saying, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And we need to make sure everyone benefits from these technological advances, not just a select few.
Couldn't agree more. And that brings up another really interesting question. What happens when the things that become most valuable aren't things you can just buy and sell?
Okay, you're going to have to elaborate on that one because you've officially lost me.
We were talking earlier about clean air, water, a healthy planet. What if those become the truly scarce resources, the things that people are willing to pay a premium for?
I mean, we're already seeing that a little bit, right? People paying more for organic food, for products with less packaging.
Exactly. And as those resources become even scarcer, it could fundamentally change how we think about value. It's not just about producing more stuff, it's about protecting what we have. It's about sustainability, about long-term thinking.
Wow. So we went from gas prices to, like, the fate of humanity in one episode. Not bad.
I told you this stuff was interesting.
That's what I love about a good deep dive. You really never know where it's going to lead.
It's all connected, though. And understanding those connections, those underlying forces, that's what allows us to make better choices. As individuals, as businesses, as a society.
So, deep divers, we hope you've learned something new today, maybe gained a fresh perspective. And hey, next time you're faced with a price hike or you're scrolling through those online shopping deals, take a minute to think about those invisible forces at play, supply and demand. Because this isn't just theoretical stuff we're talking about. It's shaping the world around us every single day. And on that note, we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Okay, so you've requested a deep dive into something that's been making headlines and impacting wallets everywhere, inflation and deflation. And you're not just here for buzzwords, right? You want to understand the forces at play, how are they measured, and what they might mean for your life. Well, strap in, because we're about to unpack all of that using this insightful article from ClearTax. Let's start with a scenario I'm betting we're all familiar with. Imagine strolling into your favorite cafe, ready for your daily caffeine fix, only to find that your usual latte just got hit with a price hike.
Frustrating, isn't it?
Well, that, my friend, is inflation in action.
Precisely. It's the phenomenon of rising prices across the board, not just for your morning coffee. And it's not just about noticing a difference here or there. Economists actually measure this using specific indicators like the Consumer Price Index or CPI.
Okay, time to tap into your expertise here, because I'll confess, economic indicators aren't exactly my go-to conversation starters. What exactly is CPI, and how does it reflect inflation?
Great question. Think of CPI as a representative basket of goods and services that everyday consumers purchase, things like food, housing, transportation, and yes, even that latte. The CPI tracks how the prices of these items change over time. If the cost of that basket goes up, it signals inflation.
So it's like taking the pulse of an economy by looking at the prices of those everyday essentials. That makes a lot of sense. The ClearTax article uses this interesting example of apples to illustrate this, right?
Yes. It points out that if a kilogram of apples cost, say, $10 last year, and now the same amount costs $11, that's a 10% jump in price, a clear indicator of inflation. And when these kinds of price increases become widespread across different sectors, that's when economists really start to pay attention.
So we've established that inflation is about rising prices, and it's measured by tracking the cost of goods and services over time. But here's where it gets really interesting. The ClearTax article mentions that a healthy rate of inflation actually exists. Now that sounds counterintuitive. Why wouldn't we want prices to stay put or even go down?
It's a common misconception that any inflation is a bad thing. In reality, a small amount of inflation, around 2–3%, is generally considered healthy for a growing economy.
Okay, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Why is that the case?
Think of it this way. A little inflation usually indicates that people are confident about the economy. They're spending money, businesses are investing, and wages are rising. It's a sign of a dynamic and expanding economic landscape.
So a bit of inflation is like a pulse, a sign that the economy is alive and kicking. But the Clear Tax article also delves into what happens when inflation gets out of control, right?
Right.
What are some of the culprits behind those price surges that send economists scrambling?
The article highlights several key factors. One significant driver is the money supply, essentially the amount of money circulating within an economy.
Right, because if there's more money sloshing around, wouldn't that lead to a decrease in its value, making things more expensive?
Exactly. It's a matter of supply and demand. When the supply of money outpaces the supply of goods and services, prices tend to rise. This can happen for various reasons, such as government spending or changes in central bank policies.
The article also connected national debt to inflation, and I'll admit that one always makes my head spin a bit. Can you help untangle that connection for me?
Absolutely. When a country accumulates a large national debt, it often needs to borrow more money to cover its expenses. This can increase the money supply, potentially leading to inflation if not managed carefully.
So it's a bit like a domino effect. Excessive borrowing can fuel inflation. The Clear Tax article goes on to discuss demand pull and cost push inflation, which sound intriguing, but also a tad technical. Can you break those down for us?
Of course, imagine a wildly popular product hitting the market, a new gadget, a limited edition sneaker, you name it. Everyone wants it, demand skyrockets, but the supply can't keep up. What happens? Prices surge. That's demand pull inflation in action.
So it's like those concert tickets that sell out in minutes,
hmm
and then you see them being resold online for triple the price.
hmm
Makes sense. What about cost push inflation?
Cost push inflation occurs when the cost of producing goods or services increases, forcing businesses to raise prices to maintain their profit margins. Think back to those supply chain disruptions we experienced recently. Remember the global chip shortage that impacted everything from cars to electronics?
Oh, I vividly remember those days. It felt like everything was either out of stock or significantly more expensive.
Exactly. Those shortages drove up the cost of components, which then rippled through various industries, ultimately leading to higher prices for consumers. That's a classic example of cost push inflation in action.
So whether it's soaring demand for a hot new item or rising production costs due to external factors, these forces can push prices upward, leading to inflation. Fascinating. Now let's flip the script and talk about the often misunderstood cousin of inflation, deflation. Is it simply the opposite, where prices go down and everyone rejoices, or is there more to this story?
Deflation is a tricky beast. While cheaper goods and services might sound appealing on the surface, persistent deflation can actually be a warning sign for an economy.
Really? That's surprising. Why is that the case? Wouldn't lower prices be a good thing for consumers?
While it might seem counterintuitive, deflation can lead to a vicious cycle. When prices are consistently falling, people might postpone purchases, expecting even lower prices in the future. This can cause a decrease in consumer spending, which is a major driver of economic growth.
So it's like a deflationary spiral. Falling prices lead to delayed spending, which further depresses prices. It's a bit like that feeling when you see a fantastic sale, but then you wonder if it's too good to be true and if there's something wrong with the product.
That's a great analogy. The ClearTax article highlights a couple of significant contributors to deflation. One is increased competition, which can be a double-edged sword.
Right, because on the one hand, more competition usually benefits consumers by offering more choices and potentially lower prices. But I can see how it could become problematic if it gets too intense.
Precisely. While healthy competition is generally a positive force in a market economy, excessive competition can lead to a race to the bottom on prices.
So instead of innovating and improving products or services, companies become fixated on undercutting each other, which could hurt their long-term prospects and potentially lead to deflation if prices are pushed down too far.
Exactly. The ClearTax article also points to technological advancements as another potential driver of deflation.
Now, that's an interesting one because technological progress is generally seen as a positive thing, right? I mean, think about how much more affordable and powerful our devices are today compared to just a decade ago.
Absolutely. Technological innovation is a crucial engine of economic growth, but it can also contribute to deflation in certain scenarios.
Yeah.
Think about it. When technological advancements lead to significant increases in productivity, companies can produce more goods or offer more services with fewer resources.
So while that's fantastic for efficiency and potentially lower prices in the short term, it could also lead to deflation if those price reductions happen too rapidly or become too widespread.
Exactly. It's all about finding a balance. Now, let's shift gears and bring all of this back to you, the listener, because understanding inflation and deflation isn't just about acing your economics exams. It's about equipping yourself to make informed financial decisions in the real world.
Absolutely. We're not here to just drop some economic theory and leave you hanging. We want to help you connect these concepts to your own life and finances. So how can understanding inflation and deflation translate into practical advice for managing our money?
One of the most critical takeaways from the ClearTax article, in my opinion, is the importance of considering inflation when it comes to long-term savings, particularly for retirement.
Because even a seemingly small percentage of inflation each year can significantly erode the purchasing power of your savings over time, right?
Precisely. For instance, let's say your goal is to have a certain amount saved by the time you retire. You can't just assume that that same amount of money will have the same buying power in 20 or 30 years.
That makes a lot of sense. So how do we combat this invisible force of inflation eating away at our hard-earned savings?
The key is to invest your savings in a way that outpaces inflation. This is where diversifying your portfolio comes into play, as the ClearTax article suggests.
Okay, so diversification. It's a term we hear a lot in the finance world. But for those of us who might not be investment gurus, can you break down what it means and why it's so important in the context of inflation?
Absolutely. Diversification is essentially a risk management strategy. It's the idea of not putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. Instead of investing all your money in a single asset class like stocks or bonds, you spread your investments across different asset classes.
So a mix of stocks, bonds, real estate, maybe even some commodities or alternative investments, depending on your risk tolerance and financial goals.
Exactly. The logic is that different asset classes tend to perform differently under various economic conditions. So, if one investment isn't doing so hot, you have others to cushion the blow, potentially mitigating losses and hopefully staying on track to reach your financial goals.
It's like the old saying, don't bet the farm on one horse. Or in this case, don't bet your entire retirement on one investment. Makes perfect sense.
And speaking of managing risk and keeping our economic ship afloat, the ClearTax article mentioned the Reserve Bank of India's role in all of this. It made me realize that there are institutions actively trying to steer the course when it comes to inflation and deflation.
Absolutely. The RBI is like the central bank of India, and one of their primary responsibilities is maintaining price stability within the country. They're like conductors trying to orchestrate a harmonious balance in the economy. Okay, I love that analogy. So how do they actually attempt to control these economic forces? What tools do they have at their disposal?
Well, one of their most powerful tools is adjusting interest rates.
You mean like the interest rates we pay on loans or earn on savings accounts? How do those tie into the bigger picture?
Those are definitely part of it. By raising or lowering those key interest rates, the RBI can influence how much money people are borrowing and spending. If inflation is heating up, they might raise rates to cool things down a bit, encouraging saving over spending. If they're worried about a slowing economy and the threat of deflation, they might lower rates to try to stimulate borrowing and spending.
So it's a delicate balancing act, trying to keep the economy humming along without letting inflation spiral out of control. It makes you realize that there are a lot of moving parts behind these economic forces we often hear about in the news.
And this deep dive has focused primarily on India, based on ClearTax article. But it sparks a broader question. What other factors, both domestic and global, might be influencing these economic forces?
That's a great point. It's like we've opened this Pandora's box of economic intrigue.
Yeah.
Are there other global players, events, or trends that impact what we're seeing in India, even on a local level?
Absolutely. The global economy is intricately interconnected. Everything from international trade agreements and geopolitical events to supply chain dynamics and even climate change can influence inflation and deflation across borders.
It really highlights how important it is to stay informed and view these issues through both a local and global lens. So to our listener out there, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep connecting the dots. Look into the current inflation rate in your own country. Reflect on how those global events we talked about might be playing out in your community or even your own household budget. Because understanding these forces isn't just about acing an economics quiz. It's about navigating the complexities of our world and making informed choices for ourselves and our futures. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of inflation and deflation. Hopefully, you're walking away with a clearer understanding of these economic forces and how they can impact your financial well-being. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you on the flip side of this wild economic roller coaster we call life.
Okay, so you know how everyone's always talking about interest rates, right?
It's definitely a hot topic.
It feels like every time I turn on the news, it's Bank of Canada raises rates, and I'm like, okay, that's got to affect me somehow, but like,
Yeah.
how exactly?
Yeah, it can be a little confusing.
So that's what we're diving into today, how interest rates hit, well, home, like literally your house and your wallet. And luckily, we've got this great source from CIRO, the Canadian Investment Regulatory Organization, to kind of break it all down.
Yeah, their information is super useful as like a starting point
Yeah,
because a lot of people, they find interest rates kind of mystifying.
totally. It's one thing to know what it means when they say interest rate. It's a whole other to know what to actually do with that information.
Exactly.
So, interest rates 101, let's start there. What exactly are interest rates? And like, why should we even care?
So basically, an interest rate, it's the cost of borrowing money or the return you get when you save or invest. CIRO actually breaks down some of the key interest rates. Like there's the policy interest rate.
Oh, yeah, that's the one the Bank of Canada sets, right? The one that's always in the headlines.
Exactly. It's like the benchmark. It influences all the other interest rates we see. And then there's the prime rate.
Okay, and that one is.
That's the one banks use as their baseline, especially for lending to their most trustworthy customers, the ones with good credit.
So, like, if the Bank of Canada raises that policy rate.
Then the commercial banks, they usually follow suit,
Right.
increase their prime rates too.
Ah, so it's like a domino effect.
Exactly. And that makes stuff like loans, lines of credit, all that more expensive for everyone.
Okay, that makes sense. So before we jump into how all this affects things like mortgages or like investing, let's talk about how the interest is actually calculated. Because CIRO mentions simple versus compound interest.
Right.
And that's where things can get, well, impactful.
Yeah, for sure. So simple interest is, well, it's simple. It's only calculated on what you originally borrow or invest. Say you loan someone $100 at a 5% annual simple interest rate.
Okay.
They'd owe you $5 in interest by the end of the year. Pretty straightforward.
But compound interest, that's where it gets interesting.
Exactly. It's like interest on your interest. Say you've got $1,000 invested at, let's say, a 5% interest rate compounded annually. So at the end of the first year, you'd have 1050, right? But then in year two, you're earning interest on that 1050, not just the initial 1,000.
Oh, wow. So it just keeps building on itself.
Yeah, and over time,
Mhm.
especially long term, that can really add up.
That's awesome when you're earning it. Probably a little less fun when you're the one paying it on a loan, though.
Definitely, yeah. That's why really understanding how both simple and compound interest work is super important.
For sure.
It can make a huge difference in the long run for your finances. Doesn't matter if we're talking savings accounts, loans, investments. You've got to know how the interest is being calculated.
Absolutely, yeah. Couldn't agree more. Okay, so we've covered like what the different types of interest rates and the how that interest is actually calculated, but how does this actually like play out in real life for our listeners?
Yeah, so the CIRO source breaks it down into three main areas:
Okay.
borrowing costs, what you earn on your savings, and then investment returns. Those are the big
Yeah.
ones.
Okay, well, let's start with something I think we can all relate to. Mortgages.
Right, because borrowing costs in general, those are hugely impacted by interest rates.
For sure.
But yeah, when you get into mortgages, it's that whole fixed versus variable rate decision. That's where things get really interesting.
Because with a fixed rate, you're basically locking in a certain rate
Exactly.
for a set period of time. So it doesn't even matter what those market rates are doing, your payments stay the same.
Exactly. So even if rates go up after you've locked in your mortgage, your payments are still the same. But of course, the opposite is true too.
Yeah, if they go down, you're kind of stuck.
Exactly. You're stuck with that rate you locked in.
It's all about, I guess, do you want the certainty or do you want to kind of gamble a little bit?
Yeah, exactly. Risk versus reward, right?
Right, exactly. Speaking of loans, though, I feel like a lot of people listening probably have student loans.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And the source mentioned that the federal student loan interest rates, those are tied to market rates.
Yeah, so how that usually plays out
What does
is
that even mean?
when market rates are low, then those federal student loan rates, they're going to be lower too,
Okay.
which is great for borrowers, obviously.
Yeah.
But then when those market rates rise, which we've seen lately, those loan repayments, they can get a lot more expensive.
Oh, so it can go both
It
ways.
can definitely go both ways.
It's like a roller coaster a little bit. You got to kind of be prepared for the ups and downs.
Yeah.
But it sounds like whether it's a mortgage or it's student loans, you've really got to have a plan for managing that debt.
Absolutely. Having a budget, exploring your options,
Mhm.
maybe debt consolidation, those are all good things to think about.
Okay, so that's all about paying interest. What about earning it? How do interest rates affect, just our regular savings?
Right, because, yeah, it's easy to focus on the negative
Yeah.
when you're talking about debt and all that, but there's also the potential to actually earn more interest when those rates go up.
Okay, yeah, because CRO mentioned that when rates rise, financial institutions, they often have to offer higher rates, right?
They do.
On things like savings accounts and GICs.
Exactly. They want to stay
Yeah.
competitive.
Right.
So, yeah, your money, it has the potential to grow more quickly in a higher interest rate environment.
So that's actually good news for savers in a way.
To an extent, it is.
Yeah.
But, and this is a big but, we always have to remember inflation.
Right, because we can't just focus on the interest rate itself.
Exactly. Exactly. Got to look at the bigger picture. You could be earning, a decent interest rate on your savings, but if inflation's going crazy, your money's not going as far as it used to.
So it's like a race.
It really is,
Your
yeah.
savings have to outrun inflation.
They do. If you want your money to, maintain its purchasing power.
Wow. Okay. And then beyond just savings accounts, there's like the whole investment world,
Right.
which can feel a little overwhelming.
It definitely can.
We're talking GICs, stocks, bonds. CIRO mentions them all. It's a lot. Where do we even begin with that?
Let's take it one step at a time, just like the source does. We can break it down by investment type.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Let's do it. Okay, so we were in the middle of talking about how different investments, how they react when interest rates start going up or down.
Yeah.
And we started talking about GICs a little.
Right, right. So with GICs, you're basically locking in that rate of return
Right.
for a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
So when rates are going up, GICs, they can seem a lot more attractive because, well, you're locking in that rate that might be higher than what you'd get, down the line.
So it's like you're kind of trying to time the market, but
Yeah.
you've got that guaranteed return.
Yeah, you could say that. Understanding where those rates are going, that can definitely give you an advantage.
So are there strategies for that, for making the most of it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's one that's actually pretty common. It's called GIC laddering. So rather than putting all your money into one single GIC with, one maturity date, you spread it out
Okay.
across different GICs, different terms.
Yeah.
That way you can take advantage of those higher rates as each one matures.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so that's GICs. What about the stock market, though?
Ah, the stock market.
Because that feels like a whole other...
It is a whole other beast. It's not always as simple, cause and effect.
Right.
But generally when those rates go up, it gets more expensive for companies to borrow money,
Right.
which can eat into their profits.
And that, of course, affects the stock price.
Exactly. For investors, they're always looking ahead, right?
Yeah.
Trying to anticipate those profits. So if it looks like profits might go down, people get nervous.
They start to sell.
Yeah. And it's not just about company profits either. If rates go up, other investments like bonds, those can become more appealing to investors too.
Okay. Yeah, because if you can get a better return elsewhere,
Exactly.
why not?
So that can actually lead to like a shift of money.
Out of the stock market.
Yeah, people move their money around.
Interesting. Okay, so bonds.
Yeah,
They seem to be a big part of this whole puzzle.
they're a big player, that's for sure. One key thing to keep in mind is that bond prices and interest rates, they usually move in opposite directions.
Oh, interesting. How so?
So let's say interest rates are rising. Existing bonds, the ones with those lower rates that were set earlier, those are suddenly a lot less attractive to investors.
Because you could get a better rate with a new bond.
Exactly. Why buy something that's giving you a 3% return when there's a brand new bond offering 4%?
Right, right. But then that means...
It gets tricky, yeah, because if you need to sell that older bond, the one with the lower rate, you might have to sell it for less than you paid.
Oh, because nobody wants it.
Exactly. It's about making it appealing, even though it's got that lower rate.
Wow. So it's not enough to just know the interest rate. You have to kind of
You got to see the whole picture.
think about how it's all connected.
Right. And CRO, they really emphasize that. It's not just about, individual things going up or down. Interest rates, they're really a reflection of the bigger economic picture.
Okay, so we've been talking about these specific examples, but how do interest rates reflect the economy as a whole?
Well, they're like a signal. They tell us if the economy is healthy or maybe not so healthy and where it might be going. Central banks, like the Bank of Canada here, they use interest rates to try to keep things stable.
Okay, so break that down for me. I'm 5. If rates are doing this, what does that usually mean for the economy?
Okay, so simplified version. When the economy is growing really fast, like red hot and prices are going up, that's inflation central banks, they usually raise interest rates.
To kind of cool things down a bit.
Exactly. because higher rates, they can discourage borrowing and spending, which should, in theory, help bring inflation down a little.
Okay.
But then, on the flip side, if the economy is slowing down, inflation's low, then they might lower interest rates to encourage people to borrow, spend, invest, kind of give things a little boost.
So it's all about finding that balance.
It's a balancing act, for sure, and it's complicated.
Yeah, there's a lot to keep track of.
There is, but even understanding the basics can make a big difference. Knowing how it all works, how it affects your finances, that's what empowers you to make those smart decisions.
Yeah, you don't have to be like an economist or anything.
Exactly.
Just got to be informed.
Exactly. Do your research. Ask your financial advisor questions. Be proactive.
Love it. Okay, well, we covered a lot today. Everything from how interest is calculated, simple versus compound, never forget, to how interest rates can affect your mortgage, your savings account, investments.
It's all connected.
And we even touched on the big picture, how it all fits into the economy as a whole.
And how understanding all those connections can really help you make those smart money moves.
Exactly. It's been great having you on, as always. And listeners, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Ever feel like you're walking into a meeting and everyone's speaking a different language?
Yeah.
Like throwing around terms like GDP growth, making predictions about the economy, and you're nodding along, trying to look informed, but secretly you're like, man, I wish I paid more attention in Econ 101.
It's like you need a decoder ring sometime.
Exactly.
Just to understand the business section. Right.
Which is why today we are doing a deep dive into one of those terms that gets thrown around like everyone already gets it.
Right.
GDP.
And believe me, even if you think you know GDP,
Yeah.
there's always more to uncover. We're going behind the scenes, and we're using this IMF Finance and Development article called Gross Domestic Product, an Economy's All.
Seriously, they weren't kidding with that title.
It really is.
They really weren't.
Trying to capture everything, really.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty,
Yeah.
let's start with the basics. What is GDP?
So at its very core, GDP is a measure of a country's economic activity. And it's measured by the total monetary value of all the final goods and services produced within a country's borders
Okay.
in a given period, typically a year. So it's
Yeah.
like a giant calculator adding up everything that's bought and sold.
Okay, so it's not just about how much stuff is produced, though, right? It's also about the value of that stuff.
Exactly.
Like a high-end smartphone contributes more to the GDP than like a pack of gum, even though they're both...
Precisely. It's about the market value
Yeah.
of what's produced. But here's where it gets interesting. So GDP isn't just tracking iPhones and chewing gum. It also includes things that aren't sold in the traditional sense, like government services.
Right, like public education or the fire department.
Exactly.
We don't buy those services directly, but they're still essential parts of the economy.
Absolutely.
So that kind of brings up another question, though. If GDP is trying to measure everything, what doesn't it measure? What's falling through the cracks?
That's a crucial question, because what GDP doesn't measure is often as important as what it does. For instance, one major thing it overlooks is unpaid work, like household chores or volunteer work.
Ah, so that's why my amazing homemade sourdough bread hasn't made me a captain of industry.
There you go.
All those hours kneading dough, completely invisible to the GDP, which honestly feels a little unfair, don't you think?
It does highlight a real issue where a lot of work and essential work, a lot of times done by women, is invisible to these traditional economic measures. And it's not just housework, right? Think about stay-at-home parents, caregivers. They're making huge contributions.
Yeah, absolutely.
But those aren't accounted for in GDP.
Yeah, it seems like we're only seeing part of the picture if we're not factoring that in. What else is missing?
Another significant factor that GDP doesn't fully capture is depreciation.
Depreciation. Is that like when my car loses value the second I drive off the lot?
Well, you're on the right track. In economic terms, depreciation refers to the wear and tear on machinery, equipment, and buildings used in the production process. These assets have a lifespan, and their value diminishes over time as they are used.
So it's like a factory using its machinery until it eventually needs to be replaced.
Exactly. And while GDP accounts for the initial investment in that machinery, it doesn't fully reflect the ongoing cost of that depreciation. It's like assuming a delivery truck will last forever, even with constant use.
It's like we're trying to understand a person by just looking at their bank statement.
That's a great analogy, yeah. Gives you some insights, but it doesn't tell you everything about their life or their values or anything like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of values, Our article dives into this thing called real GDP. Is that about getting to the heart of that?
It's about getting a clearer picture, I'd say.
Okay.
So you see, when we talk about GDP, we need to be careful about, are we talking about nominal GDP or are we talking about real GDP?
Okay, I'm sensing an important distinction here.
Here is.
Break it down for me.
All right. So nominal GDP, that's like looking at the economy through a magnifying glass. But the magnifying glass changes size every year.
Okay.
It reflects the prices that are happening now.
Right.
But of course, those can be distorted by inflation.
Ah, inflation. That thing that makes everything seem more expensive over time, even if we're not actually producing more stuff.
Exactly. That's it. So if a cup of coffee, the price doubles because of inflation,
Yeah.
nominal GDP would say, oh, the coffee industry is twice as big as it was last year,
Right.
even if people are drinking the same amount of coffee.
Yeah, it's misleading.
Totally.
So how do we adjust for that?
That's where real GDP comes in.
Okay.
It factors out the impact of inflation. So it gives us a way to measure, are we actually producing more?
Right.
Or is it just this illusion because of inflation? It's like we're comparing things with a measuring stick that stays the same length year after year.
Okay, so it helps us see if the economy is actually growing or if it's just that inflation illusion.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, so that makes a lot more sense. But this whole measuring thing got me thinking. How do we actually calculate GDP? It's not like we can weigh a country's economic output on a giant scale, right?
That would be something, wouldn't it?
Right.
Fortunately, economists have a few different ways.
Okay.
Three, in fact.
Okay.
Three main approaches to calculate GDP.
All right.
The production approach, the expenditure approach, and the income approach.
Okay.
Think of them as three different paths, all leading to the same destination.
All right. I like that analogy. Guide me down these paths.
Okay, so let's say we're using the example of building a house just to illustrate.
Okay.
The production approach, that looks at the value added at each stage of the process.
Okay.
So we think about, okay, the lumber mill, how much value did they add by processing the wood? Then the contractor, how much value did they add by actually taking that wood and turning it into a house?
So we're adding up the value created at each step of the way.
Exactly. Now, expenditure, that's coming at it from the buyer's perspective.
Yep.
So what did the homeowner spend to buy that house? Were there any loans involved? That kind of thing.
So it's about who paid what to bring this house into existence.
Exactly.
Okay. What about income then?
So the income approach, that focuses on all the income that's earned through this whole process. The wages of the workers, the profits of that contractor, were any taxes collected.
Okay. So whether we're tracing the value added, the money spent, or the income earned, we should theoretically arrive at the same GDP figure.
Ideally. Exactly.
Okay.
That's the beauty of the system.
Yeah.
In theory, while there might be slight statistical differences, they should all kind of converge on the same number.
Okay. That's reassuring. Sounds like economists have really put some thought into this whole measuring thing.
They have, yeah.
But let's get real here for a second.
Okay.
Why should the average person listening to this even care about GDP? Like, what does this actually tell us about how the economy is impacting their everyday life?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Essentially, GDP growth, or the lack of it, it has a ripple effect throughout the economy.
Okay.
And that ripple, it reaches all of us.
So when GDP is up, things are generally good, but when it's down, batten down the hatches.
Basically, yeah. When you see a growing GDP, more jobs are being created, businesses feel more confident, they're investing, they're expanding, more money is flowing through the economy. That can lead to higher wages, people are spending more. There's this sense of optimism, right?
Yeah, it's like a rising tide lifts all boats, as they say.
To a certain extent, yeah. However, we also have to remember that not everyone benefits equally from GDP growth. But we'll get into that.
Right. Okay. So we've got this number. GDP gives us a sense of how the economy is doing overall, but it doesn't tell us everything. It's kind of like a health checkup that only measures your height and your weight.
Yeah,
Like helpful, but doesn't really tell you if you're actually healthy.
exactly. And that brings us to some of the limitations of using GDP as this be-all and end-all measure of economic progress.
Right. So if GDP is like a health checkup that only checks your height and weight, what other vital signs are we missing here? What else should be on the checkup?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, right? Because while GDP measures that economic output, it doesn't really tell us that much about the quality of life inside a country.
Okay.
You know, it's like judging a meal solely on how much it weighs. You're missing out on flavor, nutrition. You know, do people even enjoy it?
Yeah. A country could have like a sky-high GDP, but still have tons of poverty, inequality, or even just people being unhappy.
For sure. GDP doesn't differentiate between good growth and bad growth.
Right.
Like cleaning up an oil spill is treated the same as producing the oil in the first place.
Wow, that seems like a pretty significant oversight. Are there other ways to kind of measure a country's progress that take those things into account?
There are. One that's really well known is the UN's Human Development Index. You've probably heard of that.
Yeah, big
Ins-
crowd.
Instead of just income, it looks at things like how long are people living? What are the education levels? What's the standard of living really like?
It's like saying, okay, you have money, but are you living a good life, a long life?
Exactly. And it paints quite a different picture than GDP alone.
Oh, okay.
Some countries with
Yeah.
relatively high GDP have surprisingly low HDI rankings because of things like inequality or lack of access to healthcare.
So it's like a reality check on those GDP numbers.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay, cool. Are there other measures, like, are there any that go beyond just economics and try to assess, like, overall well-being?
Yeah, there are a few. One you might find interesting is it was developed in the country of Bhutan. It's called the Gross National Happiness Index.
Okay. I've heard of this, yeah.
It measures things like psychological well-being,
Mm-hmm.
community vitality, environmental conservation.
It's like they're saying, hey, maybe economic growth isn't the only path to happiness.
Yeah, and it might be onto something.
Right. Okay, so these alternative measures, they're not perfect, obviously, but they do highlight this need to kind of take a more holistic view, right?
Yeah,
One that considers people and the planet
absolutely.
alongside those economic indicators.
It's not just about how much money's sloshing around, but how are we using that money?
Exact.
And is it actually leading to better lives for people?
Okay, and that actually brings us to another important thing about GDP, and it's using it to compare different countries.
Right.
Because we always hear about, oh, this country's economy is so much bigger than this country's, it's growing faster.
Right.
But how do you even compare economies that use different currencies
It's tricky.
and have different costs of living?
For sure, because you can't just do a straight-up currency conversion,
Right.
because that doesn't tell you what that money can actually buy in those countries.
Like a dollar might get you a cup of coffee here, but it could buy you a whole meal somewhere else.
That's it, yeah. That's where you got to bring in this idea of purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Okay.
And what it tries to do is level the playing field a little bit. So it considers how much does a basket of goods and services actually cost in different places.
So instead of just looking at the exchange rate, we're comparing the price of like a haircut or a loaf of bread in different countries.
Exactly. So PPP helps us understand, okay, what does someone's income actually get them in their local economy? It gives you a more realistic way to compare living standards across different countries.
This has been really interesting. We've learned that GDP can be super useful for understanding economic activity, but it's not the end-all be-all.
No,
It's important to look beyond just those numbers
for sure.
and consider what they really tell us about a country and its well-being.
Think about what's driving the growth. Who's benefiting? What other factors should we be thinking about when we're trying to assess how a country's really doing?
Right, because a thriving society, it's about more than just dollars and cents. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to live that long, healthy, fulfilling life.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive into the complex, fascinating world of GDP.
The whole economy.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
It is.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time for another fascinating exploration. You know how sometimes you hear those stories about trade deficits? And like everyone's freaking out, or the opposite, right? Trade surpluses, and suddenly it's all celebrations.
Yeah.
Well, get ready, because today we're going deep on the balance of trade.
We're doing a deep dive, and it's honestly way more interesting than it might seem at first glance.
That's what you always say, but you always seem to be right.
What's fascinating about the balance of trade, often called the BOT.
BOT, got it. Like a robot, but for trade.
Exactly. It's how often people completely misunderstand it. They get so caught up in this idea of good or bad.
Right, like a simple thumbs up, thumbs down.
But trade, it's just not that simple.
Okay, so no easy answers then. You've definitely got my attention. I've been looking through like a whole stack of articles here, notes, and honestly feeling a bit overwhelmed. Let's rewind back to basics. What even is this thing, this balance of trade?
At its core, the BOT is really just saying, how much is a country exporting minus how much it's importing?
Simple subtraction.
Yeah. It gives you a sense of whether they're selling more stuff to the rest of the world than they're buying, or the other way around.
So more exports, that's a surplus, like
Yeah.
extra, right?
Right.
And then more imports, that's our deficit. We're in the hole a bit.
Exactly.
Okay, that seems easy enough, I guess. But you're saying there's more to it, or you wouldn't be here?
100%.
Yeah.
You can't just focus on that final number. Think of the BOT like a snapshot. You know,
Okay.
it captures one moment, but it doesn't tell you the whole story of a country's economy, whether it's healthy or not.
Right, right.
So a trade deficit, for example, isn't automatically a bad thing.
Really? Because my Econ 101 professor, I swear, made it sound like the ultimate economic sin.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it gets a bad rap. And on the flip side, a surplus isn't always something to throw a party for.
Hold on, wait. Really? That seems counterintuitive.
It's all about context.
Mm-hmm.
Let's use the United States as our example here.
Okay, perfect example. Everyone knows about the U.S.
The U.S. has been running a trade deficit consistently for decades now.
Yeah, it's always in the news.
And it hasn't exactly been economic doom and gloom, right?
We're still here.
Exactly. In fact, and this might surprise you, the U.S. actually ran a trade deficit for almost every single year between 1800 and 1870.
Whoa. I had no idea. That's a pretty long streak. And we made it through that just fine. So, what's the deal then? If a trade deficit doesn't automatically mean a country is, like, failing,
Mm.
what does it actually tell us? What are we supposed to understand?
It's about the nuances. Always more going on beneath the surface. Like, let's say a country, any country, they've got this trade surplus.
Okay, looks good on paper, right? They're exporting more than they're importing, winning.
Right, but what if that's only happening because their currency is weak?
Okay, yeah, how does that play into it? I always forget about currencies.
So if your money's weak, your stuff suddenly looks cheap to other countries, right?
Like a giant sale.
Exactly. So their exports might jump up. Everyone's buying because, hey, bargain. But it might not mean their products are actually better, you know?
Just cheaper.
Sometimes, yeah. Winning on price, not quality, to put it one way.
Interesting. Okay, so then, opposite problem, trade deficit. Does that automatically mean a country's economy is weak?
Not at all. Could actually mean the opposite in some ways.
Come on, now you're just messing with me.
No, think about it. A country with a deficit, they're importing a lot, right? Which means their people have money to spend, they're buying stuff from everywhere.
So it could just be a country full of shoppers. That's actually kind of reassuring. I like to shop.
Exactly. But again, never the whole story. Remember that article about China?
Which one? We talked about a bunch. Oh, right. The one where their trade surplus went crazy high at the beginning of the year?
Yeah, January, February of 24.
Right. So what was going on there? Seemed like good news at the time.
On the surface, right? Like their economy was on fire. But then you dig a little and you see their imports had actually tanked.
No one was buying from them?
Not as much, no.
Mm.
So it wasn't that they were exporting like crazy. It's that their own people weren't buying much at all. Potentially a bad sign, you know.
Economic uncertainty, maybe?
Could be. Point is, the surplus there, kind of deceptive if you don't look closer.
Wow, so it was actually like a warning sign disguised as good news.
Exactly. And that brings us to something really important, this idea of the bigger picture. The balance of trade, it's just one piece of it.
You keep saying that, and now I'm dying to know, what is this bigger picture we should be looking at? So we've got this puzzle, right? The big economic picture, and our balance of trade is just one piece. What else is there? Like, what are we trying to put together to really understand what's going on?
Okay, so the BOT, it's actually part of this even bigger, more complex thing called the balance of payments.
Which is, remind me, it's been a hot minute since econ class.
Think of it like, imagine a massive spreadsheet, right? Tracking every dollar that flows in and out of a country. That's the BOP.
Okay, so everything, not just the stuff we buy and sell.
Right, way more than that. You've got your trade, obviously, goods and services, that's the BOT part. But then there's like investments coming in from foreign countries, money that people are sending back home from overseas.
Oh, right, remittances. Right, I've heard about that. Huge source of income for some countries.
Exactly. And then even things like, you know, government stuff, foreign aid, that all gets factored in.
So it's really getting a sense of the total money flow in and out, not just the, like, supermarket checkout line of what we're buying.
Perfect analogy. And that's why it matters so much. Because to really get a read on a country's economic health and to understand what the BOT is really telling us, you can't just look at that one number by itself. It's got to be alongside all these other economic factors.
Okay, so what kind of factors are we talking about? Give me the rundown.
Well, the big ones. Inflation, right? That's huge these days. Then unemployment numbers. How's the job market doing? And overall economic growth. Is the pie getting bigger, or are we fighting over slices?
Right, it's like, okay, so you've got a trade surplus. On paper, sounds awesome.
Right, we're selling more than we're buying. But what if, at the same time, inflation's through the roof?
Yeah, your money's not going as far, even if you've got more of it.
It's exactly. Or think about a recession. Economy shrinking, demand drops, right?
Yeah.
People buy less stuff, both inside the country and from overseas. What happens? Imports go down, which can sometimes, kind of accidentally, lead to a trade surplus.
So you might look like you're winning on trade, but really it's just that everyone's too broke to buy anything.
Exactly. A surplus isn't always a good sign. You got to look at what's causing it. Same thing with the deficit. Doesn't automatically mean doom and gloom. Could be a country that's just got high consumer spending, which isn't always a bad thing.
Okay, so I'm getting it. Don't get seduced by a single number. Gotta zoom out, look the whole picture.
100%. And that's what we always try to do here, right?
It's the deep dive, after all. So if people are going to take away one big thing from today about this whole balance of trade thing, what should it be?
Don't freak out or celebrate, for that matter, based on the BOT alone. Look past the headlines.
Don't just read the tweet, as they say.
Exactly. What's driving that surplus or deficit? What else is happening in the economy? Ask those questions.
Context is everything. You sound very wise today.
Well, I learned from the best.
Mhm.
And hey, don't forget about those exchange rates. Those can really mess with a country's trade balance.
Right. Strong currency sounds good, but not always when it comes to selling your stuff overseas.
All connected, right? The global economy, it's wild. But this is a good first step, understanding this stuff.
Absolutely. Well, listeners, I feel like we've done some serious unpacking today. The balance of trade, it's more nuanced than it seems. Way more.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So next time you see those headlines, you know the ones, trade deficit this, trade surplus that. Remember, there's always more to the story. Dig deeper and never be afraid to ask, what does it really mean? That's what we do here on the Deep Dive. Until next time. All right, so we're diving into the OECD this time around.
The OECD.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
not
okay.
exactly a household name, right?
No, not exactly a catchy acronym for like a must-listen podcast or anything.
Definitely not the most thrilling combination of letters.
Right.
But from what I've seen, it's actually way more interesting than it sounds.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us about it? Like, for someone who's hearing OECD for the first time, what's the elevator pitch?
Well, you can think of it kind of like a global club
Okay.
with a pretty exclusive guest list.
Exclusive, huh? Like, who gets to be in this club?
So it's mostly countries that are considered, developed economies.
Right, right.
But it's not just about being wealthy. They also have to be committed to democratic values and a market economy, things like that.
So it's not just an economic club.
Exactly. It's more about working together to address global challenges
I see.
that affect everyone.
Okay, so what kind of challenges are we talking about here? Give me some examples.
Oh, just about everything you can think of. Education, healthcare, climate change, international trade, even things like digitalization and artificial intelligence.
Wow, that's a pretty wide range, isn't it?
It really is.
You'd think with so many countries involved, it'd be tough to get everyone on the same page.
It definitely has its challenges, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? To find common ground and come up with solutions that work for everyone.
I guess so, but do they actually make a difference? Like, does all this research and collaboration actually lead to real-world change?
Actually, yeah, they do. The OECD provides a lot of valuable data and analysis that governments and organizations use to inform their decisions.
Like what? Give me an example.
For instance, they played a key role in developing the concept of purchasing power parities, or PPPs, which helps us compare economic data across different countries more accurately.
PPPs, huh? That sounds familiar, but I'll admit I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a brain twister, but we'll definitely unpack that more later on.
Okay, good, because that's one I definitely need a refresher on.
For sure. But for now, let's stick with the OECD itself for a bit, if that's all right.
Oh, yeah. No, that's great. Let's do that. So we've got this club of countries. They're tackling these big issues. They're doing research, influencing policy. What else? What's something surprising about the OECD that most people probably don't know?
Well, one thing that might surprise people is that they're really focused on well-being, not just economic growth.
Well-being. That's interesting. So they're not just about, like, GDP and all that.
Right. They actually do a lot of work on measuring things like happiness, life satisfaction,
Yeah.
and social progress.
Huh. That's pretty cool. I mean, it makes sense, right? Money isn't everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They even have this initiative called Beyond GDP, where they look at alternative ways to measure progress.
Beyond GDP, I like the sound of that.
Right. So they're really trying to broaden the conversation about what matters most.
Okay, I'm starting to see why you find this organization so interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's not just some stuffy old think tank. They're actually dealing with real-world issues that affect all of us. And
exactly.
they're looking at the bigger picture, not just the bottom line.
I couldn't have said it better myself. They're all about finding solutions that create a better future for everyone.
Okay, so let's get back to those PPPs,
Yeah.
purchasing power parities.
Right.
You teased that a little bit earlier, and now I'm really curious, what's the deal with these PPPs?
Okay, so have you ever traveled to, say, like Europe or Asia
Yeah, definitely.
and noticed how prices for like basic things can be wildly different?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I remember this one time I was in, I think it was Vietnam,
Okay.
and I got this amazing meal, like street food.
Yeah.
Amazing. And it only costs like $1.
Right. You get that.
Just crazy.
You can't even get a coffee for that here.
No way.
Yeah.
So is that what PPPs are all about? Like figuring out how far your money actually goes in different places?
Exactly. It's basically a way to compare how much you can buy with the same amount of money in different countries.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do they actually calculate that?
Well, they use this thing called a basket of goods.
A basket. What's in
Yeah.
this basket? Groceries.
Kind of, yeah. It's
Yeah.
basically a collection of everyday goods and services, like food and drinks, clothing, transportation, housing.
Okay, so like all the essential stuff.
Yeah. And they track the prices of all these things in different countries.
And then compare them.
Exactly. So let's say a basket of goods costs $100 in the US,
Okay.
but that same basket costs only $50 in, say, India.
Okay, so that means what? My money goes twice as far in India.
Exactly. You got it.
Wow, that's really interesting. I never thought about it like that before.
Yeah, it's a different way of looking at things than just using exchange rates.
So where does the OECD come into all of this?
Well, the OECD is one of the main organizations that actually calculates and publishes PPP data.
Oh, I see. So they're like the keepers of the basket.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And they use that data for all sorts of things, like comparing living standards across countries,
Hmm.
analyzing economic growth.
I bet that comes in handy.
It does.
So if we're looking at the world through these PPPs, what are some things that might surprise people? Like, are there any countries that seem a lot richer or poorer than we might think?
That's a great question. One thing that often surprises people is that when you factor in PIS-IPs, some countries that may not have the highest GDPs actually have really high standards of living.
Oh, really? Like who?
Well, a lot of European countries, for example, score very high on things like quality of life and social well-being, even if their economies aren't as large as, say, the US or China.
Interesting. So it's not all about just how much money a country has. It's about how far that money goes for the people who live there.
Exactly. It's about the actual purchasing power and what people can actually afford to buy with their income.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about what PPPs are and how they're calculated, but I'm still a little fuzzy on why this is also important.
Sure.
Like, why should we care about this? How does it affect us in the real world? So, like, how does knowing about PPPs actually change anything?
Well, for one thing, it can really change how we view global inequality.
Oh, okay, how so?
We often hear about the huge gap between rich and poor countries, right?
Right.
But when you factor in PPPs, that gap often narrows significantly.
Really? So, like, a country that looks really poor based on just their GDP might actually be doing a lot better in terms of their citizens' actual living standards.
Exactly. Because their money goes further.
Huh. That's fascinating.
It can also make a big difference for things like international aid and investment.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean.
Because if you're deciding where to allocate resources, you want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples, right?
Definitely.
Not just looking at raw numbers.
So PPTs give a more accurate picture of where the needs are?
Exactly.
This has really got me thinking. It's
Yeah.
like we often make assumptions about the world based on these simplified statistics, but PPPs show us that there is often a lot more to the story than meets the eye.
I think that's a great takeaway from all of this.
So, to wrap things up, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to remember about the OECD and these PPPs?
I think the key takeaway is that the world is a complex place,
Ain't that the truth?
and understanding it requires looking beyond the surface.
Don't judge a country by its GDP.
Exactly. Dig a little deeper, look at the data, and you might be surprised by what you find. And hey, the OECD is a great resource for that kind of exploration.
It is, yeah. They've got a lot of really interesting stuff on their website.
They do.
So if any of this piques your interest, dear listener, go check it out.
Yeah, dive in.
You might just discover a whole new way of looking at the world,
Absolutely.
and maybe even some travel inspiration along the
I
way.
know, that's right.
All right, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Always happy to talk about the OECD. Remember that time you put off buying a house for like a year because interest rates were just crazy, and then they just kept going up?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've all been there. And figuring out how this whole monetary policy thing works, it can feel like you're trying to decipher a foreign language.
Absolutely.
But good news, everyone. Today, we're going on that deep dive into the world of monetary policy.
That's right.
And trust me, you don't need an economics degree to understand it. We've got some excerpts from a fantastic Investopedia article to guide us. And these guys, they are like the Shakespeare of finance. They know their stuff.
Yeah, Investopedia is great for this kind of deep dive. They break down even the most complicated financial concepts,
Exactly.
make them easy to grasp.
So let's get down to brass tacks. What is monetary policy?
Yeah.
Essentially, it's how a country manages its money supply to influence the economy.
Right.
Think of it like a control panel for a giant spaceship.
Okay.
Except instead of lasers and warp speed, we're talking about things like interest rates and inflation.
A very fitting analogy.
Okay.
And to stick with that for a moment, just like you wouldn't want your spaceship careening out of control,
Right.
you don't want your economy to be wildly unpredictable either. That's where the Federal Reserve, or the Fed, as it's often called, come in. They're the ones steering the ship using monetary policy to keep things stable.
So they're like the ship's captain,
Exactly.
deciding when to hit the gas or apply the brakes.
Precisely.
I like it.
Their main goal is to create an economic environment where things are running smoothly, without the ship, so to speak, overheating or stalling out.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is controlling inflation.
Okay, so we're not talking about inflating a tire here.
Yeah.
What exactly does inflation mean in the economic sense?
You're right. It's not about tires.
Good.
In simple terms, inflation is a general increase in the prices of goods and services over time. Remember that cup of coffee that used to cost $1 just a few years ago?
Okay, yeah, now it's like $3.
Right.
So inflation is basically our money becoming less powerful over time.
Exactly.
Not cool.
And it's not just about your morning coffee getting pricier. As inflation rises, it eats away at the value of your savings.
Right.
That money you're putting aside for a rainy day, it doesn't have the same purchasing power it used to.
Yikes. That's a scary thought. It's like our money is slowly dissolving.
In a way, yes. And high inflation can create a ripple effect throughout the economy.
Whoa, okay.
Businesses have to constantly raise prices. People feel uncertain about the future.
Yeah.
And it can even lead to social unrest.
Okay, so keeping inflation under control, definitely a top priority.
Yeah.
But how does the Fed actually do that? They can't just snap their fingers and make things cheaper, right?
You're right. It's not quite that simple. They have a few powerful tools at their disposal.
Okay.
And one of the most important ones is interest rates. Think of interest rates like the cost of borrowing money.
Okay, so when the Fed raises interest rates, it becomes more expensive for people to take out loans,
Exactly.
like for a mortgage or a car loan.
Exactly. And when borrowing becomes more expensive, people and businesses tend to borrow less,
Makes sense.
which means they have less money to spend. This can help to slow down the economy and, in turn, cool down inflation.
So it's all connected. Higher interest rates, less spending, slower inflation. But our Investopedia article also mentioned something called open market operations. That sounds a bit more complex.
It sounds intimidating, but it's actually a fairly straightforward concept. Essentially, the Fed buys or sells U.S. Treasury bonds in the open market. These bonds are like IOUs issued by the government.
Okay, I'm following so far.
Good.
So how does buying and selling these bonds impact the economy?
Well, imagine the Fed pumping billions of dollars into the economy by purchasing these bonds. This injection of money increases the money supply.
And more money in circulation generally leads to
Lower interest rates. Remember, it's all about supply and demand. And with lower interest rates, borrowing becomes cheaper, businesses invest more, and consumers spend more freely.
So it's like the Fed is kind of subtly steering the economy just by controlling how much money is out there.
Right.
They make it rain, interest rates drop, people party, or they like pump the brakes, things tighten up, inflation chills out. Fascinating.
That's a great way to put it. And then there's the other side of that coin, selling those bonds. When the Fed sells bonds, they're essentially pulling money out of the economy. This can decrease the money supply and push interest rates up.
It's like a giant financial balancing act.
Yeah.
But the Fed isn't the only player in this game, right? Our Investopedia article also mentioned something about fiscal policy.
You're absolutely right. Monetary policy, which we've been discussing, is just one part of the economic puzzle. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, involves government spending and taxes.
So if the Fed is like the conductor of an orchestra, is the government more like the composer,
Oh,
setting the overall tone with its budget and tax policies?
I like that analogy. Think of it this way. If the economy is a car, monetary policy is adjusting the speed and steering, while fiscal policy is deciding whether to step on the gas pedal, through increased spending or tax cuts, or to hit the brakes through decreased spending or tax hikes.
And just like driving a car, you need both to work in harmony for a smooth ride.
Precisely. The article highlights the importance of coordination between monetary and fiscal policy, especially during times of economic crisis. Remember the 2008 financial crisis?
How could I forget? It felt like the whole world was on edge.
Right. During that time, the government stepped in with a massive stimulus package, essentially injecting money into the economy to prevent a complete collapse. Simultaneously, the Fed slashed interest rates to near zero, making it as cheap as possible to borrow money.
So it was a two-pronged approach, a bit like a 1-2 punch from a boxer to try and get the economy back on its feet.
Exactly. It was a coordinated effort to stabilize the financial system and restore confidence.
Wow, this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexities of managing an economy. It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about people's lives, their jobs, their futures.
Couldn't agree more. And while we've covered a lot of ground today, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Understanding the nuances of monetary policy and how it interacts with fiscal policy can seem daunting, but it's empowering.
Absolutely. It allows us to make more informed decisions about our own finances, our investments, and even our careers. So the next time you hear about the Fed making a move or the government announcing a new budget, you'll have a better understanding of the forces at play. And hey, you might even impress your friends with your newfound knowledge at your next dinner party.
I wouldn't be surprised.
For those who want to dive even deeper, we highly recommend checking out that full Investopedia article. The link is in the show notes. And remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to navigating the world of finance.
Ever notice how some government decisions kind of make your wallet feel a little lighter or heavier? Yeah,
Right.
that's fiscal policy in action.
Yeah.
We're diving into your submitted Investopedia article today to break down this really powerful tool.
It's more than just like numbers on a budget sheet.
Right,
Right.
right.
It's about how those decisions create jobs, impact like the price of your morning coffee, and shape the entire economic landscape.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The article's main point is that fiscal policy tries to juggle all of these huge economic forces.
Exactly. We're talking job growth, stable prices so that your money goes further, and overall economic expansion.
So it's about finding that right balance to keep all of these different economic factors in harmony.
Yeah.
Speaking of finding balance, the article highlights economist John Maynard Keynes as a central figure in U.S. fiscal policy. What makes his theories so important?
Well, Keynes basically flipped the script on how governments viewed their role in the economy.
Uh-huh.
Before him, the prevailing thought was, like, let the market figure it out.
Yeah.
But Keynes argued that during those really tough times, the government could step in and give the economy a much-needed boost.
That's where the idea of spending money to make money comes in. Right?
Yeah.
It sounds maybe a little strange at first.
It might seem counterintuitive, but it's based on the idea that if the economy is sluggish and people are holding back on spending, the government can step in and stimulate demand, which gets things moving again.
Like giving the economy a jump start when the battery dies. So how exactly does the government jumpstart the economy? The article mentions two main types of fiscal policy: expansionary and contractionary.
Think of it like adjusting the thermostat in your house.
Okay.
When it's too cold, you turn up the heat, right?
Right.
Expansionary fiscal policy is really similar. The government might increase spending, cut taxes, or even both to kind of inject money back into the economy and stimulate growth.
And this takes us to the example of the Great Depression. President Roosevelt used expansionary fiscal policy during that time, didn't he?
He did. And the New Deal programs are a perfect example. Remember those massive public works projects like the WPA, which put millions of Americans back to work building roads and bridges? Or the establishment of Social Security, a safety net for the most vulnerable. Those were huge government initiatives designed to, get the economy back on its feet.
Those are some really tangible examples of how government spending can have a direct impact on people's lives. But the article also mentions deficit suspending, the government spending more than it takes in through taxes. Doesn't that raise some red flags?
It's a valid concern, and it's one of the most debated aspects of fiscal policy.
Right.
Deficit spending essentially means the government is going into debt to finance its spending.
So it's a calculated risk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea is that by stimulating the economy, you eventually generate more economic activity and more tax revenue, which helps pay down the debt over time. But it's definitely a balancing act.
Okay, that makes sense. So if expansionary policy is like turning up the heat, what about when the economy gets overheated? Like when inflation starts to climb and prices go crazy.
You're spot on. That's where contractionary fiscal policy comes in. It's like turning down the thermostat to cool things down.
Mm.
This might involve measures like raising taxes or reducing government spending to try and, rein in inflation.
But isn't that a hard sell politically? I mean, nobody wants to vote for higher taxes or fewer government services, right?
You're hitting on a crucial point.
Yeah.
Contractionary policies, while sometimes necessary to keep inflation in check, are often unpopular. It's a delicate balancing act for policymakers.
It sounds like it. Now, is the government the only one calling the shots in this economic balancing act? The article also mentions something called monetary policy. How does that fit into the picture?
Excellent question. If we think about managing the economy, like driving a car,
Okay.
fiscal policy is like one person with their hands on the steering wheel and gas pedal. But there's another person in the car, the Federal Reserve,
Mm-hmm.
and they control monetary policy.
2 drivers, 1 car. This is getting interesting. Tell me more.
So while the government uses spending and taxes,
Mm.
fiscal policy, the Federal Reserve has its own set of tools to influence the economy.
Uh,
They focus on things like interest rates and the money supply.
okay.
For example, if the economy needs a boost, the Fed might lower interest rates to make borrowing cheaper, encouraging spending and investment.
It's almost like 2 drivers trying to reach the same destination, but maybe with slightly different ideas about the best route to get there.
That's a great analogy. Fiscal and monetary policy often work in tandem, but they can sometimes be at odds, especially when you have different political agendas at play.
This is giving me a whole new perspective on how the economy works. So it's not just about understanding these policies in isolation, but also how they interact with each other and the political realities that shape them. This is fascinating stuff.
It really is. And it leads perfectly to some key takeaways and a thought-provoking question for you.
So we're back. I'm starting to see how much goes into managing an economy. It's like a giant machine with all these moving parts, and fiscal policy is, one of the big levers they use to keep it running.
It is. And remember, even though we're talking about macroeconomics, these policies have a very real impact on, like, your day-to-day life.
Absolutely. Okay, before the break, we were comparing fiscal and monetary policy. It sounds like those two are always making headlines, often as a point of contention.
Yeah, you're right. It can be a real dance between the government and the Federal Reserve.
Mm.
And like any good dance partners, sometimes they step on each other's toes.
So walk me through that. What are some of the potential points of friction?
Well, a key difference is their respective timeframes. The government, through its fiscal policies, often has its eye on the short term, boosting a slowing economy before an election.
Right.
The Federal Reserve, on the other hand, plays more of a long game, focusing on sustainable growth and stable prices over the long haul.
So let's say the government wants to create jobs right now. They might lean towards spending more, even if it means increasing the deficit. But the Federal Reserve, with its long-term view, might be worried about inflation down the line and prefer a more cautious approach.
Precisely. Balancing those short-term needs with long-term stability is one of the trickiest parts. And it's important to remember that there's no, like, one-size-fits-all solution.
It's not an exact science. So much depends on the current state of the economy, global events, even political pressures. It sounds like a lot to keep track of.
It is. And that's why understanding even the basics of fiscal policy can be so empowering. It helps you make sense of the news, have more informed conversations, and even advocate for the economic policies you believe in.
Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to something as important as the economy. So to recap for our listener, what are some key takeaways from our deep dive into fiscal policy?
Well, first and foremost, fiscal policy is a powerful tool that governments use to influence the economy. It involves two main levers: government spending and taxes.
And just like you wouldn't use a hammer for every job, the government needs to use the right fiscal policy tools for the given situation.
That's a great point. When the economy is sluggish, they might use expansionary policies,
Hmm.
increasing spending, cutting taxes, or both to stimulate growth.
Like stepping on the gas to speed things up.
Exactly. But when the economy is overheating and inflation becomes a concern, they might use contractionary policies,
Mhm.
raising taxes or cutting spending to, cool things down.
So it's like easing off the gas or even tapping the brakes a little.
A perfect analogy.
Mm.
It's about finding that sweet spot to keep things running smoothly.
And we can't forget about that other driver in the car, right? The Federal Reserve with its monetary policy tools.
Right. They're like the co-pilot, keeping an eye on the gauges and making adjustments with interest rates and the money supply to, keep the economy on track.
It really makes you appreciate the teamwork involved in managing a complex system like the economy.
Yeah.
But like any good team, there must be times when they don't see eye to eye.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like any good partnership, communication and coordination are key, especially since their goals and timelines might differ. The government might prioritize those short-term wins while the Fed focuses on long-term stability, which can sometimes lead to tension. Yep.
It's fascinating to consider those dynamics and how they play out in the real world. This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the intricacies of fiscal policy and its impact on, well, everything from jobs to prices.
Yeah, it's all interconnected, isn't it? And it affects your life in more ways than you might realize.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap things up, I know you have a thought-provoking question to leave our listener with, something to ponder as they navigate this complex economic landscape.
I do. We've explored the tools of fiscal policy, the challenges of balancing growth and stability, and the that delicate dance between the government and the Federal Reserve.
Mm.
So my question for you is this: imagine you're advising the president on fiscal policy right now. What would be your top priority? Would you push for increased spending to boost job creation, even if it means increasing the deficit? Or would you prioritize tackling inflation, even if it means making some really tough decisions about taxes and spending cuts?
That's a great question. There's no easy answer, is there? It really makes you think about your own economic priorities and what you believe is best for the country's future.
Precisely. And that's what makes this such an important and engaging topic. Fiscal policy is a conversation we should all be a part of. By understanding the basics, staying informed, and engaging in thoughtful debate, we can all contribute to shaping a more prosperous and equitable future.
Well said. That's a perfect note to end on. Listener, we hope this deep dive into fiscal policy has empowered you with the knowledge and context to navigate this complex but fascinating subject. Until next time, stay curious. All right, let's do this. Today, we are tackling business cycles.
I know.
You know that feeling when the economy's like a roller coaster? Up
Yep.
1 minute, down the next. We're going to break it all down. What causes those swings, how to spot them coming, and how not to lose your lunch money when they hit.
What's wild about business cycles is they're a bit like waves out in the ocean.
Okay.
We know we're going to have those periods where everything's humming, expansion.
Right,
But then, just as sure as the tide, things slow down, contraction hits.
right.
But it's like the exact when and how strong each one is.
Yeah.
That's the tricky part. That's what keeps things interesting.
So no magic crystal ball to tell us the perfect time to buy low. Bummer. But, okay, using your wave thing, what's it actually feel like when we're in an expansion? Like, what are we seeing out in the world?
Okay, so picture this.
Yeah.
Businesses are going gangbusters, new projects, everywhere you look. Everyone's trying to hire the best people.
Sounds like a good time to be a job seeker.
It really is. It's like you've caught the perfect wave, that rush as you're going with it.
Yeah.
Consumer confidence, it's through the roof. You can practically feel the optimism in the air.
Exhilarating.
Mm.
But no wave lasts forever.
You got it. Eventually, you hit the peak, like the
Yeah.
crest, right?
Right.
And it feels like maybe we can ride this forever. But that's rarely how it goes, is it? And this is where things can start to wobble a little bit.
Okay, so let's talk about when that wave starts to crest. That's where we get into the dreaded C word, right? Contraction.
Yeah.
Like, are we at the top of the roller coaster about to go down?
Exactly that feeling. Like, the only way from here is down. Businesses get cautious, hiring slows. You might start seeing more sales signs popping up,
Yeah.
places trying to keep things moving.
Yeah, nobody likes seeing for lease signs outnumbering now hiring. But it can't be all doom and gloom forever, right? Tell me there's a light at the end of this economic tunnel.
Oh, absolutely. Like every wave crashes on the shore eventually. Every contraction, it bottoms out. This is the trough,
Okay.
lowest point of activity. And yeah, it can feel like you're stuck. But the trough, it's crucial too. It's like the reset button. The economy stabilizes, and then
Yeah.
we start building momentum again.
Okay, so we've got these phases, each with their own vibe. But how do we actually know which one we're in? Like, it's not like there's a big economic calendar that's like, congratulations, you're officially in a contraction.
Right. No giant calendar.
Yeah.
Instead, we've got economic indicators. Think of them like, um,
It's signs.
yeah, signs, buoys out on the water. They give us clues about the current, which way things are moving.
Right.
We've got GDP. It measures all the stuff a country produces, the total
Your
value.
health report of the economy.
Exactly.
So GDP's up, economy's good. Simple as that.
Generally, yeah. But there's more to it.
Yeah.
We look at employment numbers, too. How many people working, how many looking. Gives us a sense of how confident businesses are. Are they hiring, expanding, that kind of thing.
What about inflation? That's a word I feel like is everywhere these days. Is that another one of those economic buoys?
Oh, definitely. You ever notice, like, your groceries are more expensive?
Mm-hmm.
Or that new phone you want? Price is creeping up.
Yeah, for sure.
That's inflation doing its thing.
Yeah.
Because when the prices for stuff in general go up, and economists, they watch it very closely.
So it's not just about knowing when a recession is happening, but trying to get ahead of it based on these indicators. That's huge. But with so many factors, how do we make sense of it all?
That's where understanding how the indicators work together, the patterns,
Mm-hmm.
that's key. Like, say, businesses see people aren't spending as much.
Uh-huh.
They might produce less, right? That can make GDP go down.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe jobs are lost, which makes people spend even less. It's a ripple effect.
Wow. So one thing leads to another, like a chain reaction. This is where I feel like having even a little bit of this economic know-how, it could really help people like me. If we can spot those warning signs early,
Right.
maybe we can adjust, like our own money moves based on that, right?
Exactly. It's all about seeing those currents, knowing which way to adjust your sales. Now, while we can all get better at this, there's actually like a whole group of economists. Their job is calling these phases officially the National Bureau of Economic Research,
They're like the
NBER.
right, the NBER. So they're like the referees of the economy, deciding when a recession officially starts and stops.
You got it.
But instead of a whistle, they're what, issuing reports and stuff?
Exactly. They look at all those indicators we talked about,
Mhm.
GDP, employment, inflation, how much people are spending, the whole 9 yards. And they use that to figure out if the economy's really slumped and for how long.
That's wild. So if they take their time making the call, doesn't that mean there's a lag between what we're seeing out in the world
Oh, yeah.
and when something's officially labeled?
Big time. It could take
Oh.
months, sometimes even like quarters, for them to crunch the numbers, make the call, and that lag, super important to remember, especially when you think about how other folks react, investors, for example.
You're talking about the stock market, right?
Yep.
I've
Yep.
always heard the stock market's like a leading indicator. It freaks out before the rest of us even know what's up.
True. It reacts to what it thinks is going to happen, not always what is happening right now. So if investors see those early signs we talked about,
Like consumer confidence dipping, that kind of thing.
exactly, they might think, oh, rough seas ahead, and they start selling off stocks.
So if enough investors get spooked, start selling, could that actually cause a downturn? Like fear itself becomes the driving force.
That is a great point. And yeah, while the stock market doesn't control the economy, it definitely reflects like the overall mood, you
Yeah.
know, the anxieties about where things are going. And if businesses see the market tanking, they might get cold feet about their own stuff, like putting off new projects, not
Yeah.
hiring as many people.
So it can become this like downward spiral.
Exactly. Fear and uncertainty, they feed into more contraction.
Okay, so understanding how investors behave and how that ties into the economic indicators. That's key to riding these cycles. Like we're learning to read the waves even if we can't control the ocean, right?
100%. And while we can't ditch risk completely, understanding these cycles, it helps us make smarter choices in our own lives and in business.
So it's not just about riding the wave, but like getting better at spotting which way the wave's going to go next.
Right.
What else do we need to keep in mind when it comes to this whole business cycle thing?
Well, one of the biggest things to remember is knowledge.
Mm.
It's power. The more you understand about these cycles, the better decisions you can make for yourself. Like, let's say you're thinking about a big purchase, house, car, whatever.
Oh, yeah, big life stuff.
Knowing where we are in the cycle, that can make a huge difference.
Makes sense. It's not about like timing the market perfectly or anything, but realizing that the economy has seasons, just like the weather.
Exactly. So if you know a contraction is likely, maybe you hold off on that purchase, build up some savings just in case. On the other hand, when things are good, expansion time, that might be your chance to go for it. Start that business, get that degree, take that dream trip.
So it's all about being flexible. Knowing the economy goes up and down and rolling with it, we can actually ride the waves instead of getting crushed by them.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been a seriously eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I get it now, the stuff that makes the economy tick.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
And remember, it's not about becoming an economist overnight. It's about having that knowledge and using it to make choices that help you reach your own goals.
Well said. Now, thinking about everything we've learned today, how are you going to approach your finances, your career, all that? Keep those questions in mind, folks. And until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.
Remember that trip you were planning? The one where you're finally going to visit that place you've always dreamed of. Picturing yourself strolling through those markets, all those amazing crafts and delicious food, and then, bam, you got to exchange your money. Suddenly, those prices don't look quite as good, right?
Yeah, exchange rates can definitely feel like a bit of a roller coaster sometimes.
Totally. And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We're going to break down those mysterious forces behind those numbers that never seem to stay put. We'll be using this article, Factors That Influence Foreign Exchange Rates, to guide us.
Think of it as a little cheat sheet to understanding how the global economy ends up impacting what you're paying for things.
I like that. A cheat sheet. Okay, so let's start with the basics. We're talking about foreign exchange rates, which, if we're being honest, is just how much one country's money is worth compared to another, right?
Exactly. It's like the price tag you see on a currency.
Okay, so the article really leans into the whole supply and demand thing. They say that's really the big driver here. Like, imagine if it was Black Friday and there was that one super popular gadget. Everyone and their mother wants it, but there are only few to go around.
You'd have a massive frenzy with everyone trying to get their hands on it, prices going through the roof, high demand and low supply, classic economics.
And it's the same with currencies, right? Like, if everybody and their dog wants euros, but there's not a ton of them just floating around out there, their value is going to skyrocket.
Exactly. It's the same market forces at play.
So the article then breaks down these 5 big factors that really mess with exchange rates. I think we should try to unpack those, don't you?
Let's do it. Let's decode these big players.
Okay, so first up, inflation. That's a word we hear everywhere, but the article explains how it basically eats away at our money's value.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. High inflation just means you need more of your currency to buy the same amount of stuff. Imagine that loaf of bread you used to get for like $2 suddenly costing you $2.50.
It's like your money is constantly playing catch up with its own value.
It's like a never-ending game it can't win. And unfortunately, that makes holding that currency a lot less appealing, so it can lose value in the foreign exchange market.
So if a country is dealing with insane inflation, their money could take a real hit on the global stage.
That's right. Think about it. Let's say this country with out-of-control inflation makes electronics. Those electronics just got a lot more expensive to produce, right?
And if they're pricier to make, they're going to be more expensive to buy.
Exactly. And that impacts demand. People might start looking for cheaper alternatives, and suddenly that country's exports take a hit, which, you guessed it, can impact their currency's value.
So if a country's dealing with runaway inflation, their money's basically on a one-way trip to devaluationville. But hey, let's move on to the next culprit on our exchange rate hit list, interest rates. I'll admit, this one always makes my head spin a little.
Well, think of it this way. Imagine countries are throwing these massive savings account parties.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
And everyone wants to go to the party with the best returns, naturally.
Makes sense. So the countries with high interest rates are like the cool kids everyone wants to hang out with, attracting investors left and right.
You got it. Higher interest rates mean investors can earn more, so they're drawn to those currencies like moths to a flame. It's a global competition for who has the most attractive savings account.
Now that you mention it, haven't there been a bunch of interest rate hikes in the news lately?
Oh, absolutely. It's a direct response to that pesky inflation we were talking about. Central banks worldwide are raising interest rates to try and put a damper on things.
So they're trying to walk that tightrope between keeping inflation in check and making sure their currency doesn't completely tank on the global market. It's a delicate dance, for sure. Okay, so we've got inflation and interest rates doing their thing. What about deficits? Those have got to play a role, right?
Right again. Imagine a country's been on a bit of a spending spree, importing way more than they're exporting. Basically, they're shelling out more of their own money to buy foreign goods than they're making from selling their own stuff.
So they're in a trade deficit, which isn't exactly a recipe for a strong currency. Kind of like that friend who's always hitting you up for a loan but never seems to pay you back.
That's a perfect analogy. And to cover those debts, they need to buy more foreign currency, which drives up demand and can actually weaken their own currency even further.
It's like they're stuck in this loop of having to trade more and more of their own money just to stay afloat.
Yeah,
Makes you think twice about all those made-in labels, doesn't it?
it really does. Okay, up next on our list of exchange rate influencers, the article talks about how countries drowning in debt can really spook investors.
I can see why. Debt's not exactly a glowing endorsement for a healthy economy.
Exactly. Think about it. If you were lending money to a friend who's constantly in debt, you'd probably be a little hesitant to give them another loan, right?
Yeah, I'd be wondering when they'd ever pay me back.
And it's the same with countries. Investors get nervous when they see a lot of red ink because it screams financial risk. That lack of confidence can lead to a drop in demand for that country's currency.
It's like a giant game of trust fall, but with an entire country's economy on the line. All right, last but not least, we've got import-export balances. The article gave the example of India with its booming software and tea industry. So being a big-time exporter like India means you're raking in tons of foreign currency, which has got to be a good thing, right?
It's a fantastic thing. When a country's got a killer export game, it means they're bringing in more foreign currency, increasing the demand for their own currency and boosting its value.
It's like they've struck economic gold.
In a way, they have. They've tapped into a global demand, and it's paying off big time.
So it's not just about tea and software, right? Any country that figures out how to meet a global demand can see those positive effects on their currency.
Absolutely. Think about like smartphones. The whole world's hooked on them. Those countries producing them. Yeah, they're seeing a nice little bump in their currency's value thanks to that global demand.
It's like striking gold, but instead of digging in the ground, they're tapping into global desires. Okay, wow, we've covered a ton of ground here. Inflation, interest rates, deficits, debt, import-export balances. It's pretty amazing how interconnected all these factors are.
It really is. You tweak one thing and it can snowball into all these other changes.
Exactly. It's like a giant game of economic Jenga.
Mm.
But let's bring this back down to earth for a second. What does all this actually mean for our listeners?
Well, the cool thing is that understanding these factors can really come in handy, like planning a trip abroad. This knowledge can help you anticipate how exchange rates might affect your budget.
Right. Or maybe you're thinking about investing overseas. Knowing this stuff could help you spot an opportunity.
Exactly. It's all about connecting the dots between global events and your own financial decisions. Suddenly, you're not just reading headlines, you're understanding the forces behind them.
It's like having a superpower. You can decode the global economy and make it work for you.
In a nutshell, yeah.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of foreign exchange, remember this. The next time you check those exchange rates, think about those puppet masters behind the scenes, those 5 factors we talked about. That seemingly tiny shift in numbers. It could be driven by inflation woes in one country or an interest rate hike in another. And who knows, understanding those connections might just give you a leg up, whether you're planning a dream vacation, making an investment, or just trying to make sense of the financial news. It's a fascinating world out there, and now you've got the knowledge to navigate it like a pro. Until next time. All right, so picture this.
Okay.
You are craving like the most delicious bag of chips,
Mm.
and you find this vending machine,
Yeah.
but it's cash only.
Oh, no.
And you check your wallet,
Yeah.
and all you've got is a credit card. Talk about a liquidity problem, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And that's what we're diving into today, this whole idea of liquidity.
Mhm.
And you don't have to be, a Wall Street hotshot to care about this stuff.
No, not at all.
We're going to break down why it matters to everyone.
Absolutely.
So we're looking at this Investopedia article, right?
Yeah.
By Adam Hayes.
Okay.
And this guy, he's got a PhD and a CFA, so
Oh, wow.
we're in good hands.
Yeah, he knows his stuff.
He really lays out why liquidity is like important for everyone.
Yeah. It's true. It's not just for the finance people, It really impacts everyone's daily life.
Right, exactly. Like the article says, liquidity is how easily you can turn something into cash, but, and this is key, without losing value.
Right, right. That's the important part.
It's not just about having things. It's about like what you can actually do with them when you need to.
Exactly.
think about that vending machine, right? Like, you had the money for the chips, technically,
Mm-hmm.
just not in the right, like, form.
Yeah.
And because of that, no chips for you.
Tough break.
It's like that with so many things. Understanding liquidity is about making sure your money is actually working for you no matter what.
Yes, exactly. And the article makes this really good point that there are actually two main types of liquidity. Yeah. There's market liquidity, and then there's accounting liquidity.
Okay, so two different flavors of liquidity.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And understanding the difference can really change how you look at your own, you know, financial situation.
Okay, so break it down for us. What's the difference between these two?
All right, so imagine this. You need to sell something, and you need to sell it fast.
Yeah.
If you've got stocks, and you got to sell them quick, usually pretty easy, right?
Yeah, I mean, I get that.
That's because the stock market, it's generally super liquid.
Lots of action going on.
Exactly. Tons of buyers and sellers, trades happening every second.
Mm-hmm.
But like, what if you had to sell your house quickly?
Ooh, yeah.
Whole different story.
Yeah.
Real estate, that takes time. You need to find the right buyer at the right price. So real estate, often way less liquid than something like, those stocks we were talking about.
Makes sense.
So that's market liquidity in a nutshell.
Okay.
How easy is it to buy and sell in a specific market,
That makes sense. Okay, but what about this accounting liquidity? What's that all about?
So that one's more about your ability to pay off your debts, right?
Okay.
With the assets that you have available, like right now.
So it's less about the market as a whole and more about your own personal, like, money situation.
Exactly. And it's not even just about, paying your bills on time. It's
Mm.
about whether you've got enough cash that's easily accessible to, make things happen when you need to.
So it's about having options.
Exactly.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get this. So it's like that example in the article about buying a refrigerator.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if you've got $1,000 cash, you're good to go, right?
Right.
You've got the liquidity to buy that fridge, no problem.
Easy peasy.
But what if instead of cash, you had this like rare book collection?
Yeah, okay.
And it's worth, the same amount, that $1,000.
Right.
But could you walk into an appliance store and like trade your first edition Hemingway for a fridge?
Probably not.
Probably not.
It's not quite as easy as swiping your debit card, that's for sure.
Exactly. So even though those books might be valuable,
Mm-hmm.
finding someone who wants them and is willing to pay a fair price quickly,
Yeah.
that's going to be tough.
Definitely not a sure thing.
It takes time, you know. You might have to like haggle,
Oh, yeah.
put in some effort.
Yeah.
So even though you technically have the money in those books, it's just not as liquid as having the cash in hand.
Exactly. And that's the key difference.
It's like your money's kind of frozen in those books.
Yeah, sort of, yeah. It's there, but it's not exactly ready to use.
Not as handy when you need to buy a fridge.
Exactly, exactly.
So having enough liquid assets, things you can actually, turn into cash quickly, that's important for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Not just like big companies.
Oh, absolutely. This isn't just about like Wall Street and stocks. This is about your everyday life, your personal finances.
Right.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting because the article talks about how companies measure their liquidity, and it's with these things called financial ratios, right?
Okay.
But the cool thing is these same ratios, you can apply them to your own life. Even if you're not, running a Fortune 500 company.
Your brain froze. Now you're losing me.
I promise, it's way less scary than it sounds.
All right.
So let's say you're thinking about starting, like, a side hustle.
That's
Something
okay.
you've always wanted to do, right?
Yeah.
You've got the skills, you're passionate about it,
Passionate.
but maybe your cash flow isn't quite where you want it to be yet.
Yeah, been there.
Right. So before you, like, quit your job and go all in on this thing, one thing you could do is look at your own personal current ratio.
Current ratio.
Yeah, and basically what that tells you is, do you have enough, like, easily accessible assets to cover your expenses, your essential bills for a few months, just in case, things with the side hustle take a bit longer to take off than you expected.
So it's like having a financial safety net before you make that jump.
Exactly. It's like, can you cover your bills even if your income from your job dips a little bit while you're getting this thing up and running?
That's a really smart way to think about it, actually.
Yeah. And then there's another one. It's called the quick ratio,
Okay.
which is similar, but it's even more about like your immediate super short-term needs.
Okay.
So think of it like your car breaks down, right?
Yeah.
Or you suddenly need to fly home to see family.
Yeah.
Do you have enough readily available funds to cover that without having to sell anything or rack up a bunch of credit card debt.
So it's about having that peace of mind,
Yes.
knowing you can handle those curveballs.
Exactly. And if we're really talking about, like, weathering a financial storm, that's where the cash ratio comes in. That one is all about your most liquid assets. The cash you have in the bank, maybe an emergency fund,
Okay.
maybe even like that cash your grandma gave you for your birthday that you've been hanging on to.
Yeah.
It's like, if your income stopped tomorrow, how long could you, keep things afloat?
Wow.
It's a measure of your ability to meet your short-term financial obligations using only your most liquid assets, nothing else.
So you're not counting, like, selling your stuff or?
Nope, just the cash you have on hand.
Okay, so even though these ratios have kind of intimidating names, they're really just like different ways of looking at how much financial wiggle room you've got.
Exactly. They're just tools to help you understand your financial situation better. And speaking of real-world examples, the article brings up an interesting point about the stock market.
Yeah.
Remember how we were talking about market liquidity?
Yeah.
Well, they use the example of Amazon, Intel, and Ford stock to show how this plays out with investments.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. So Amazon, Intel, Ford, how does liquidity play into those companies?
Well, the article, it points out that, like, on March 13th of 2023, almost 70 million shares of Amazon stock, they changed hands.
Wow, that's
That's a lot of trading activity.
a lot of people buying and selling.
Exactly. And what that means is it's really easy to buy or sell Amazon stock without, causing a huge shift in the price.
Right.
So that's like high market liquidity in action.
Okay, so more buyers and sellers, smoother sailing for your investments. What about Intel and Ford? How'd they do?
Right. So Intel, their trading volume was a little lower that day.
Okay.
So maybe slightly less liquidity.
Interesting.
But then there's Ford.
Yeah.
They had a whopping 118.5 million shares traded.
Wow.
That's huge. And it shows you there's high demand for Ford stock.
People want it.
Yeah. Investors, they're confident they can buy or sell it easily, no problem.
So high liquidity, it makes a stock more attractive.
It can, yeah, because it feels less risky.
You're not going to get stuck holding the bag if you need to cash out.
Exactly. It's about having those options.
So all this talk about stocks and ratios, it really just boils down to understanding risk, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us back to why liquidity matters in the grand scheme of things, for you, for me, for everyone.
Right.
The article, it really drives home this point about the risk of having too much of your wealth tied up in illiquid assets.
So like having all your money tied up in that rare book collection.
Exactly. Imagine, like, you need to buy a refrigerator.
There it is again, that fridge.
Right. But instead of a new fridge, it's, a medical emergency comes up.
Oh no.
Or maybe it's a business opportunity that you can't miss.
A chance to like triple your money.
Exactly. But if all your money is stuck in things that are really hard to sell quickly without losing money,
Oof, you're in trouble.
yeah, you're kind of stuck. You might have to sell at a loss, or even worse, like completely miss out on that opportunity.
That's the danger of illiquidity.
Exactly.
So it's not about having like all your money in cash buried in the backyard.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
about finding that balance.
Exactly. It's about having some liquid assets. Think of it like your financial safety net.
Okay, I like that.
It lets you handle those unexpected things that life throws at you, You can jump on opportunities, and you sleep better at night knowing you've got options.
It's about having the freedom to act when you need to.
Exactly. And that's something everyone can relate to.
Right, whether it's a refrigerator, a business opportunity, or just knowing you can handle whatever comes your way.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, this has been a really interesting look at liquidity. It's not just a finance term. It's something that, like, touches everyone's lives.
It really does.
And for our listeners out there, here's a little something to think about. What's your own liquidity score?
Ooh, I like that.
Like, if you had to come up with, say, $5,000 really quickly, how easy would that be for you?
It's a great question to ask yourself.
It really is. It might be time to, take stock literally or figuratively and make sure your money is working as hard for you as it can.
Couldn't agree more.
This has been an awesome deep dive into liquidity. Until next time, everybody, stay curious and stay liquid.
Stay liquid.
Hey, everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are tackling a topic that gets thrown around a lot in finance, but that, frankly, few people truly seem to understand. Market efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
And what an edge in the market, really. I mean, who doesn't?
Yeah.
But what does that even mean?
Right.
Like, does anyone really know what makes this thing tick?
Right.
So today, we are diving into an article from the Corporate Finance Institute to try to cut through some of the noise around this idea of market efficiency. We'll try to figure out what it actually means in practice and why it should even matter to you. So where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, the CFI article defines market efficiency as a metric measuring information dispersion in a market.
Okay, so right off the bat, we already have something that sounds like it's straight out of an economics textbook. Can we maybe unpack that a little?
Yeah.
Like, what are we really talking about when we say information dispersion?
Sure. So essentially, we are talking about a market where information about companies and their stock is spreading efficiently, meaning that it's kind of like instant and complete and free.
So it's like this perfect utopian flow of information where everybody's always in the know?
Yeah, you could think of it like that.
Okay, but, Anne, here's the catch. How does this actually work in the real world? I mean, people love to gossip and hoard information, and let's be honest, we've all made a decision based on emotion rather than, cold, hard logic at some point.
It's true.
So is this whole market efficiency thing just a myth?
Well, that's the fascinating thing. Even though a perfectly efficient market is purely theoretical, the real world can still be surprisingly efficient. Think of it this way. Even with all the complexities of human behavior, and you know how messy information flow can be, the market kind of acts like this giant self-correcting organism. You've got all these individual investors, right? Each with their own little world of perspectives and information they are paying attention to. They're constantly buying and selling based on all that. And their actions, even when driven by emotions or incomplete information, they kind of balance each other out, leading to a surprisingly efficient outcome overall.
Okay, I think I see how that might work in theory. But it's still a bit abstract for me. Can you give me a real-world example to help me wrap my head around it?
Absolutely. Let's use Tesla as an example. Let's say hypothetically that they're about to announce this brand new electric vehicle with some revolutionary new battery technology.
Okay, so that sounds like a surefire way to send their stock price through the roof, right?
Yeah, you would think so, right? But in an efficient market, even groundbreaking news like that wouldn't necessarily cause a sudden, huge spike in Tesla's stock price.
Wait, really? Why not? It seems like everyone and their grandma would be rushing to buy Tesla stock if they knew this amazing new car was coming.
Right. But here's the thing. Investors and all these market analysts are already constantly tracking companies like Tesla. They are looking at industry trends and they're analyzing patents and they're picking up on rumors. All of this information, the anticipation of a new car model, the potential for increased market share, even the estimated production costs, it's all constantly being factored into Tesla's stock price.
So you're saying that even before the official announcement, the market has already kind of priced in the impact of this new electric vehicle. It's like the market can collectively sense these things coming.
Exactly. And that's why, in a truly efficient market, consistently predicting price movements based on news or even inside information, it becomes incredibly challenging.
So what does this mean for the average person who's just trying to understand the market and maybe even outperform it a little?
Well, it means that if you're looking to make a quick buck by timing the market or chasing the next hot stock tip, you're probably in for a wild and stressful ride.
Let me guess. It's not going to be easy.
In truly efficient markets, outsmarting everyone else consistently, it is incredibly difficult to do, even if you think you have some secret inside information.
So if markets are as efficient as you're saying, does that mean all those Wall Street analysts and all their fancy investment strategies are basically a waste of time? Like, should we all just throw our hands up and just invest in index funds? So if markets are as efficient as you're saying, does that mean all those Wall Street analysts and all their fancy investment strategies are basically a waste of time? Like, should we all just give up, throw our hands up, and just invest in index funds?
Well, that's a million-dollar question, isn't it? The truth is it's not quite that simple.
Okay, so it's not just a matter of going all in on index funds then.
Not necessarily. See, different markets operate with varying levels of efficiency. A market that's highly liquid and closely followed, like, say, the S&P 500, that's going to tend to exhibit a higher degree of efficiency.
Makes sense, since there's so much information constantly flowing and everyone's watching every little move.
Exactly. But then you have more niche markets, maybe with smaller companies, or where there's less public information available. Those might be less efficient, meaning there could be more opportunities for savvy investors to find those hidden gems.
Okay, so it's more like a spectrum of efficiency than
Yeah.
a black and white rule. Yeah, that makes sense. But for the average person who's just trying to grow their wealth, what's the key takeaway here for them?
I think the key is understanding that market efficiency isn't about abandoning all your investing strategies and just blindly throwing money at the market. It's about being realistic. It's about recognizing that information is power, But in an efficient market, that information is already baked into the price.
So how can we use that knowledge to our advantage then?
Instead of trying to outsmart everyone else, focus on developing a sound investment strategy that aligns with your personal risk tolerance and long-term goals.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into market efficiency. We've debunked some myths, explored some real-world examples, and hopefully given you a new understanding of how this concept can impact your investments. As always, knowledge is power, especially in the world of finance. We hope this deep dive into market efficiency has left you feeling a bit more confident and ready to tackle your own financial goals. Be sure to subscribe to the deep dive for more myth-busting explorations of the complex and often surprising world we live in.
So, have you ever seen those online ads? You know, the ones about like crushing it in the stock market.
Hmm.
And you think, man, I want to be crushing it. But then you remember like high risk, high reward.
Right.
And sticking your money in a savings account suddenly doesn't seem so bad.
Yeah, that's that constant push and pull between risk and return, and it's something that impacts pretty much everyone, whether you're, a Wall Street hotshot or just trying to figure out your monthly budget.
It's true. And that's actually what really got me interested in the article we're diving into today. It's like this fundamental idea, but we see it everywhere, not just, Wall Street.
Absolutely.
But okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's break down the basics here. Risk, return, what's the connection?
Well, at its core, it comes down to this. Investors, they need a reason to take on more risk. There needs to be a benefit to potentially losing money.
Makes sense.
Like, think of it this way. You could stay at your current job, right?
Mhm.
It's stable, it's comfortable.
Sure.
Or you could take a chance and start a business.
Big risk.
Huge risk could be a huge reward. Could also fail miserably. It's that potential for a bigger payoff that makes taking the risk worth it for some people.
So it's not just about how much you stand to gain, but also like how okay are you with things potentially not going your way?
Exactly. And that's where understanding all the different types of risk becomes super important. Like, for example, reinvestment risk. So back in the 80s, when interest rates were crazy high,
Oh, wow, yeah.
people were reinvesting their bond yields, but at way lower rates than what they had initially. Talk about a nasty surprise.
Wow. So it's not just this big, scary risk monster. There's like different, I don't know what, species, versions of it.
You got it. And learning about these different types of risk, well, that can give you a lot more control, right? It's not just about blindly chasing the highest return.
Okay, so what other risk species are out there?
Well, there's foreign exchange risk. Basically, what that means is if you invest in something overseas, changes in currency exchange rates can impact how much you actually make.
So, like, if I invest in a company in, say, Japan, but then the Japanese yen falls against the dollar,
Yep.
my investment takes a hit, even if that company is doing really well.
That's the gist, yeah. But you know what I found really fascinating in this article? It's the whole thing about subjective versus objective risk.
Okay, I gotta admit, I don't really know the difference. Break that down for me.
So objective risk, that's all the stuff you can measure. Historical data, volatility, numbers. Subjective risk, on the other hand, well, that's more about how you personally see that risk.
So, like, even if everything looks good on paper, if my gut is telling me something's off, that's my subjective risk radar going beep, beep, beep.
You got it. That's a great way to put it. And this is where things like behavioral finance come into play.
It's like that feeling when something seems too good to be true, Like maybe my gut is onto something here.
And you know what? Sometimes your gut is the best risk assessment tool you have. The article mentions how much risk we're each comfortable with. Our risk tolerance depends on a ton of stuff. Age, income, what our goals are, all that.
Yeah, and that reminds me, this is totally where I had to learn about risk the hard way. Remember a while back when everyone was going crazy for those, what were they called, meme stocks?
Oh yeah, the meme stock craze.
Yeah,
Talk about a wild ride.
it really was. Well, I got totally caught up in the hype, thought I could make a quick buck. Let's just say my attempt at being a, what do they call it, a diamond hands investor didn't really work out as planned.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in the excitement, especially when it seems like everyone's making money except you. But those are the times you really got to, take a step back. Figure out what you can actually afford to lose.
Yeah, a lesson I definitely learned the hard way. But this is interesting to me because I used to think like high risk, that equals huge reward automatically. But it sounds like it's not so straightforward.
Yeah, that's a common mistake. It's easy to only see the success stories, the people who took a chance and ended up millionaires. We don't always hear about the people who lost everything.
Makes you think. So it's not just about chasing the highest possible return. There's more to it than that.
Way more.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. Imagine a company, right? They decide to put everything into this brand new product. Like, this is it. This is going to change everything.
Okay, I'm imagining it.
So this product, it could be a total game changer. Like, revolutionize the entire industry, make them billions.
Okay.
Or it could totally flop. Like, nobody buys it, and they're left with nothing.
Ouch. So I get it. It's a gamble. But in the business world, just like investing, you got to take risks sometimes.
You do. But the key is, I said it before, it's got to be calculated. It's not just throwing darts at a board and hoping for the best. Research, due diligence, understanding what you're getting into, all that matters.
It's kind of like instead of just jumping out of a plane, you're making sure you have a parachute first.
I like that analogy. Preparation is key, no matter what kind of risk you're taking.
This deep dive has really got me thinking about this whole risk-reward thing in a different way, you know? It's not just about money, it's like everything.
It really is. Every decision we make has some kind of risk versus reward calculation built in, whether we realize it or not. And look, this isn't about giving you a rule book. It's more about giving you a new way to think about those choices.
And maybe, hopefully, making those choices without freaking out.
Exactly. Like, think about it. Changing careers, moving to a new city, even, I don't know, just trying a new restaurant.
Hold on, are you saying picking what to eat is a risk-reward situation?
Well, yeah. Think about it. You could order your go-to dish, the one you know you like. Safe bet.
Okay.
Or you could try something completely new. Maybe it'll be your new favorite, maybe not. A little bit of risk, but also the chance of a big reward.
I've never thought about it like that before. Man, we could talk about this all day. There's so much to it.
Oh yeah, we could talk about this for hours. Different types of investments, behavioral economics, it goes deep. But hopefully this at least gives you a better idea of the basics and why it matters, even if you aren't a big investor.
Totally. So as we wrap up this deep dive into risk and return, here's something to think about. What's one risk you've been thinking about taking lately? Something you've been putting off because you're a little scared.
It doesn't matter how big or small it is. Could be personal, could be professional. But now, think about how understanding risk a little better and knowing your own risk tolerance, how can that help you deal with that situation differently? Maybe even give you the push you need to actually do it.
Because sometimes the best things in life are on the other side of a little risk. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and until next time, stay curious. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to dive into the world of trading? We're tackling Forex and cryptocurrency today. Using this article from IG International, we're going to break it all down like your cheat sheet to understanding these markets.
And not a moment too soon, huh? These markets are really changing how we think about money, tons of buzz. So yeah, getting a clear picture of the differences is key.
For sure. So let's jump right in. This article starts by comparing who's involved in each market, helps to understand who's playing the game, right?
Exactly. With Forex, it's the big players, central banks, commercial banks, these massive financial institutions shifting huge amounts of currency globally. You know, it's that classic image of the trading floor, just on a global scale.
So Forex is more the establishment then. What about crypto? Is it all Silicon Valley kids in hoodies?
Well, you've got your exchanges and miners, of course. But what's really interesting about crypto is that everyday people are a significant part of the market. That accessibility is a huge part of the appeal, really democratizing finance in a way we haven't seen before.
Which makes you wonder, if more people are getting involved with crypto, how does its size actually compare to the more established Forex market?
That's the thing. Forex is still the undisputed heavyweight champ. But, and this is where it gets interesting, crypto's market value hit, get this, $1.5 billion in 2021. That's some staggering growth, and I think indicates a potential shift happening in the financial landscape. Even though it's dwarfed by Forex right now, that kind of rapid growth, nobody's ignoring that.
It's definitely not just a fad. Okay, we've talked about the players and the sheer size of these markets, but what about their structure? This is where I think a lot of people get confused.
Yeah, and for good reason. It can be a bit of a maze.
Yeah.
One of the key similarities, though, is that both markets are decentralized. Now, rather than getting bogged down in definitions, what's fascinating is what that means for you as a potential trader.
Okay, so no central bank calling the shots, but how does that play out differently in Forex versus crypto?
So with Forex, that decentralization happens through this global network of banks, institutions, individuals, like this massive web of transactions. Crypto, on the other hand, relies on blockchain technology.
Yeah.
Think of it like a giant public digital ledger recording every single transaction, making it, at least in theory, transparent and secure.
Right, and blockchain is a whole other deep dive in itself.
Absolutely. But for now, important to remember that this difference in the underlying technology also affects how accessible each market is to the average person.
Which brings us perfectly to our next point. This article highlights accessibility as a key difference between Forex and crypto. So, say someone's listening, totally pumped, wants to dive in. What are we talking about here? What are the barriers to entry?
Well, Forex is generally considered more accessible. You can get started with a relatively small amount of capital through traditional brokers like, say, IG International. And important for you busy bees out there, the market's open 24/5. Crypto, however, has its own set of hoops to jump through.
Yeah, I've heard setting up a digital wallet and navigating those exchanges can feel like learning a whole new language.
It definitely has its complexities. You'll need to choose a reputable exchange, navigate verification processes, and make sure your digital wallet is secure, all important, but yeah, it can be a bit daunting for a newbie for sure.
It's like the wild west of finance out there. And speaking of wild, let's talk about the thing everyone seems to associate with crypto: volatility. The article specifically mentions this as a key difference between Forex and crypto. So, for someone who's new to trading, what does volatility even really mean for them?
Yeah, volatility basically boils down to how much an asset's price jumps up and down. High volatility means you could see huge swings in price, even within a single day.
Hmm.
And let's just say crypto is known for its roller coaster level ups and downs, way more than Forex.
So, Forex is more like a steady climb, while crypto is for the adrenaline junkies.
You could say that.
Yeah.
Forex markets have their share of ups and downs, sure, but the movements are generally much more gradual. Crypto, on the other hand, can swing wildly, which means higher potential rewards, but also, much higher risks.
Okay, makes sense. Higher risk, higher reward, the classic trade off. But sounds like understanding your own risk tolerance is pretty key here, huh? Before you even think about diving into either market.
Absolutely. Knowing your risk appetite is crucial before making any investment decisions, especially in markets as dynamic as, well, as Forex and crypto.
Right. Nobody wants more surprises than they bargained for.
Exactly. And that's why this article really emphasizes doing your research, understanding the differences between these markets.
It's like anything else in life, really. You wouldn't buy a car without kicking the tires first.
Right.
And you definitely wouldn't jump out of a plane without checking your parachute twice. So why treat trading any differently?
Precisely. And just like those examples, there are ways to mitigate risks. In the case of trading, that means educating yourself, understanding the tools and strategies, maybe even seeking guidance from a financial advisor.
Knowledge is power. And a healthy dose of caution never hurt anyone either.
Couldn't agree more. There's a lot of excitement around these markets, but approaching them with a level head and a clear understanding of those potential upsides and downsides is key.
It really does feel like having a solid understanding is key here.
It really is.
Yep.
These markets are constantly evolving. What's true today might be totally different tomorrow, so continuous learning is so crucial.
Not about making a quick buck, but about really understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly. Whether you're drawn to that, more established world of Forex or the exciting kind of potential of crypto knowledge is your most valuable asset.
For sure. And luckily, resources like IG Academy really make it easier than ever to dive in and learn more.
Absolutely.
Well, we covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, everything from who's who in each market to volatility. But if our listener takes away one thing from all of this, what would it be?
For me, it always comes back to informed decision making. Do your research, understand the risks, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
Love it. It's about empowering yourself to navigate these markets with confidence.
Exactly.
That sums up our deep dive into the world of Forex and crypto. We hope you found it insightful, maybe even a little inspiring. Until next time, happy trading, and remember, keep diving deeper.
Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive into a topic that, well, might seem a bit dry at first. Financial markets.
Yeah, definitely not the most exciting thing at first glance.
Right, but we're taking that source material you all sent, Structure of Financial Markets,
Good stuff.
and we're going to extract the need-to-know info, make it clear, make it fun,
Absolutely.
so you can really understand how this whole system works.
Because it's fascinating, honestly.
Yeah, and it impacts everyone, right?
Absolutely.
Even if you aren't, working on Wall Street, it still affects you.
Every day.
Yeah.
In ways you might not even realize.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. Our source kicks things off by breaking down financial markets into two main camps: money markets and capital markets.
And the key difference really boils down to time horizon. Money markets, we're talking short-term debt securities.
Hmm.
Things like treasury bills, certificates of deposit,
Right, right.
very low risk, especially those backed by the government.
So that high yield savings account that I've been, sort of looking at,
Exactly.
that's the money market.
That's it. That's the money market in action. You're essentially lending your money out for a short period, earning a small return.
Gotcha, gotcha.
Now, if you're looking for potentially higher returns, obviously a bit more risk involved,
Yeah.
that's where capital markets come in.
Okay.
This is where you're talking stocks, bonds being traded, companies issuing new securities, investors buying and selling existing ones.
So instead of like parking my money for a few months in a CD,
Mm.
I might say invest in like a tech giant like Google or Facebook, hoping that their stock price grows over, a longer period of time.
And our source highlights how that long-term growth potential is a big draw for investors in capital markets.
Makes sense. Yeah.
However, gotta remember, higher potential returns often means higher risk.
For sure.
Capital markets can be volatile,
Oh, yeah.
influenced by a whole bunch of factors, economic conditions, company performance.
It's a balancing act, right?
It is.
Reward versus risk.
Precisely. And understanding that balance, that's key to navigating this whole world of financial markets effectively.
Speaking of navigating, our source also digs into the distinction between primary and secondary markets.
Right.
And I'll admit, those terms always kind of intimidated me.
Yeah, they sound a little scary, don't they?
But they're actually pretty straightforward.
Once you grasp the concept.
Yes, once you get past the jargon.
Exactly.
So break it down for us.
Think of the primary market as the initial launch pad. This is where companies, they're issuing new stocks or bonds to raise capital, often through what's known as an IPO, an initial public offering.
Okay, so that's like the big moment when a company's stock is first available to the public.
Exactly.
And you hear about those stories, people making a ton of money or losing it.
It happens. But what's interesting is most of the action, the trading activity, actually takes place in the secondary market.
Okay.
This is where investors are buying and selling those existing securities among themselves. Price is determined by, you guessed it, supply and demand.
So if I'm, let's say, going back to Google, if I buy Google stock today, I'm not buying it from like Google directly.
No, you're buying it from another investor who's selling their shares. And the price you pay, that reflects the current market value, which is, as you know, fluctuating constantly.
It's like this whole marketplace where the prices are being determined in real time by, all these buyers and sellers.
It's a dynamic system.
And speaking of dynamic, our source really emphasizes how interconnected all of this is to the broader economy. It really makes you think about, like we always hear about like Wall Street and then like, Main Street.
Right, exactly.
And they seem so separate, but they're really not.
Not at all.
They're very much connected.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're deeply intertwined, like you said, with our everyday lives, even if we don't always see the direct connection.
Yeah, totally. Like, give me an example.
Okay, we'll take interest rates, for instance. Those are directly influenced by how money's flowing within these markets.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so like when there's a lot of activity, high demand for capital, interest rates, they tend to rise.
Makes sense.
And vice versa, if things slow down, rates usually follow.
Huh. So that loan I'm like considering for a new car,
Yeah.
the interest rate on that is connected to like what's happening on Wall Street.
In a way, yeah, you could say that it all ties back together. Our source actually points to the 2008 financial crisis as a prime example of this interconnectedness.
Oh, right. Yeah.
When the markets crashed, remember, it sent shockwaves through the entire economy.
That's a crazy time.
Credit dried up, interest rates, they shot up, and it became way harder for businesses and regular people to get the money they needed.
Wow. It's like this domino effect. One thing impacts another. And suddenly,
It's all connected.
yeah, crazy. It makes you realize like these markets, they really need to function smoothly for everyone's sake.
Absolutely, for the whole system to work.
Right. Exactly. But going back to like different types of investments, because I found that really interesting.
Sure.
Our source also talked about this thing, exchange-traded funds.
ETFs, yeah, they're very popular these days.
Yeah. Have you ever like invested in those?
I have.
I've been hearing a lot about them, but I don't totally understand.
Sure. So basically, imagine a basket, right?
Yeah.
And in this basket, you've got different assets like stocks or bonds,
Okay.
but they're grouped together strategically, maybe by sector, like all tech companies, or based on a specific investment strategy.
So instead of putting all my money into like one company's stock,
which can be risky.
Very risky. I could buy an ETF that, like, covers the entire, say, tech sector.
Precisely. It's like instant diversification.
Oh, that's smart.
Right, which is a huge advantage for investors, as our source explains.
Spread that risk out.
Exactly. And this innovation, ETFs, they've actually changed the structure of financial markets quite a bit,
Really.
giving people more accessible, more diversified options.
It's like a one-stop shop.
In a way, yeah, for sure.
That's cool. But it makes you wonder, with all this new stuff, where do we go from here? Our source seemed to emphasize how much technology is changing the game. It's kind of wild to think about, technology just changing how, like, the whole financial world works.
It really is.
It's not even just like online trading anymore. It's like algorithms, right?
Exactly. Our source even mentioned this thing called high-frequency trading.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that term, but I don't really.
It's pretty intense. Basically, powerful computers making trades in like fractions of a second,
Oh.
taking advantage of these tiny price differences that honestly most people wouldn't even notice.
Wow, so it's like a whole other level.
Oh, absolutely. It's like the major leagues of trading.
And it makes you wonder, like, can regulators even keep up with all of this?
That's the thing, right? Our source talked about how they're always playing catch up,
Yeah, makes sense.
trying to create rules and safeguards for something that's changing so fast.
Right, because how do you even, I don't know.
Well,
It's moving target.
It is. And it's not just speed either. Like, there's this whole other wave of tech coming, like blockchain.
Oh, right, yeah, with the cryptocurrencies and everything.
Exactly. That has the potential to, like, totally revolutionize how we think about financial transactions.
It's exciting, but also, I got to admit, a little intimidating. Like, who knows what's next?
Right.
What's around the corner?
Who knows what we'll even be talking about in 5 years, even?
And the source actually left us with this question I thought was really interesting. With all this rapid change, what innovations do you think will shape, like, the future of finance?
It's a great question. Will it be AI managing our portfolios? Will we all be using decentralized finance? It's kind of mind-blowing to even think about.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on, honestly. We've covered a lot today. Started with those basics: money markets, capital markets.
Right, we talked about risk, reward,
Primary, secondary markets.
the impact on interest rates, remember that?
Oh, yeah, the 2008 crisis even came up. But then all this new stuff, ETFs, high-frequency trading.
The future of it all with blockchain.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is, but it's fascinating stuff and honestly important to understand even if you're not, a Wall Street whiz.
Absolutely. Like you said at the beginning, it impacts all of us, whether we realize it or not.
Every day.
So I hope you all learned something today. I know I did.
Me too.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning.